Chapter 1081. The car slowly entered the manor of the Bai family. When it approached the luxurious villa in the center, Li Tianlan saw Bai Qingzhao standing at the door with a frown. He was dressed in a neat military uniform, and his posture was tall and straight. The general's star on his shoulder shone with golden light. He looked a little anxious as he paced back and forth, but there was an unconcealable coldness and murderous intent on his solemn expression as he was wrapped in silver and white clothing. Xianyuan Wuxiang, who acted as the driver, sped up a little at Li Tianlan's order. Before the car came to a complete stop, Li Tianlan had opened the door and got out. He took a few quick steps to shake hands with Bai Qingzhao and said softly, "Secretary General." He called Bai Qingzhao by his title, even in private. Li Tianlan always called Bai Qingzhao by his title. But in terms of blood relationship, Li Tianlan knew very well that this was his uncle. Li Tianlan didn't want to change the way he called him, but he didn't want to hide his respect. From the bottom of his heart, Li Tianlan really had no hatred or obstacles for his biological parents and their families. He did suffer a lot when he was a child, but today he had received enough returns. He left the Li family for Huading at the age of 19. It had been nearly 6 years since then. He had seen the attitudes of the Dongqing clan and the Bai family. He had also seen what Dongqing Wudi and Bai Qingqian had done. Hatred? Resentment? Li Tianlan really didn't care about it. What was a family? It was a proposition so huge that it was difficult for anyone to explain it in detail. Different times, different situations, and different decisions would have different interpretations. Li Tianlan hadn't been in the Dongqing clan for more than 20 years. In the eyes of Dongqing Wudi, this was the family's debt to Li Tianlan. They were trying their best to make up for it. Li Tianlan often wanted to tell them that it was enough, that it was really enough, but they obviously didn't have the concept of enough or not enough. Li Tianlan could be made up for, but how could Bai Qingqian and Dongqing Wudi, who had been respectful to each other for 20 years, almost become enemies? Born in a wealthy family from the beginning of their birth, they were born with not only glory but also the responsibility to maintain this glory. Li Tianlan might have had too many things, even many of which the Dongqing clan didn't have. He stood high enough and was calm enough, so he could look at these problems more rationally. He always didn't want to call them parents, just because he was unfamiliar with this title after so many years, and it had nothing to do with anything else. "He's here." Bai Qingzhao tried his best to show a gentle smile. "Go in, everyone is waiting for you." Li Tianlan knew very well who they were. Chen Fangqing's death was so sudden that it caused the tense atmosphere before the election to completely explode. At this time, inside the manor of the Bai family, 2 directors and 2 parliamentarians of Zhongzhou state, whom Li Tianlan was most familiar with, were gathered. Later, when those key members of the giant group who did not work in Yuzhou got the news, this place would become more lively. This was the moment when a slight change in one hair could affect the whole body. What kind of attitude should they use to face the sensation caused by Chen Fangqing's death? This was something that every group was currently studying. Li Tianlan nodded and entered the villa under the guidance of Bai Qingzhao. Xianyuan Wuxiang, who didn't treat himself as an outsider, also followed them. Bai Qingzhao, who thought he was a driver, looked at him in surprise, but he didn't say anything. The 3 of them entered the study. The spacious and comfortable study was almost covered with clouds and mist. When Li Tianlan walked in, the 2 directors, Dongqing Wudi and Zhou Mulin, and the 2 parliamentarians, Bai Zhanfang and Wu Jingmin, were sitting on the sofa with a cigarette in their hands. The smoke was lingering, mixed with the incense that Bai Zhanfang had lit. The smell in the study was pungent, but there was a touch of the comfort of incense. Bai Zhanfang directly lit a cigarette and joined the ranks of smokers. He also handed one to Li Tianlan and Xianyuan Wuxiang. Li Tianlan took it and lit it. Xianyuan Wuxiang seemed to be a little curious about the smell of the cigarette. After thinking about it, he also lit it and took a puff. "It's going to catch fire," Li Tianlan said jokingly, turned on the ventilation system, and casually greeted several leaders. Zhou Mulin first, then Bai Zhanfeng, then Wu Jingmin, and finally Dongqing Wudi. He didn't know what the order of greeting was, but Dongqing Wudi's originally gloomy face obviously became a little cheerful. Li Tianlan casually found a seat and sat down. Xianyuan Wushang, who had been silent, nodded to everyone present and sat next to Li Tianlan. In the study, several big shots, who could be regarded as the leaders of Zhongzhou state, looked at each other and subconsciously at Bai Qingzhao, who had just sat down. Bai Qingzhao was also a little confused. He had never seen Xianyuan Wushang. Li Tianlan brought him into the study, which meant that Li Tianlan thought Xianyuan Wushang was qualified to come in. It was not that the leaders of the new group and the giant group talked about some stupid rules. It was just that not everyone could hear this conversation. After Chen Fangqing's death, all the spearheads were aimed at the new group. A storm was coming. This conversation might mean the strategic direction of the new group in the next 5 to 10 years. Li Tianlan brought this little fatty in, which showed his trust in him. But the other party sat down naturally, without nervousness or uneasiness. He was peaceful and calm. It seemed that he was going to discuss with them how to deal with this crisis. Who is this? Dongqing Wudi asked blankly. He looked at Xianyuan Wushang with some doubts. Well, Li Tianlan also glanced at Xianyuan Wushang. Xianyuan Wushang had been calling him Big Brother, which was natural. But Li Tianlan felt that Xianyuan Wushang was definitely older than him, even in terms of appearance. Li Tianlan shook his head slightly and introduced, "This is my younger brother." Dongqing Wudi looked confused and thought, "Where did you get your younger brother?" Li Tianlan's voice continued, "Xianyuan Wushang is a doctor." After a pause, Li Tianlan continued, "We can completely trust him. He is different from other doctors. In fact, he saved my life a day ago, and my breakthrough also has a lot to do with him. So I plan to take him to see Chen Fangqing's body. Maybe he will find some clues." Life-saving grace? They were all stunned at the same time. Dongqing Wudi fixed his eyes on Li Tianlan and said slowly, "What do you mean by saving your life? What happened in the final battle in Beihai?" It had been a day since the final battle in Beihai. From the beginning to the end, all of Li Tianlan's performance, Wang Xiaoyao, Li Kuangtu, Jiang Shangyu, and even Wang Tianzong's sword energy had been sorted out and sent to all over the world. The high-level officials of Zhongzhou state had also received detailed reports. Li Tianlan was indeed threatened, but no one saw that Li Tianlan had experienced any crisis of death. Was it Wang Tianzong? Bai Zhanfang suddenly asked. Li Tianlan shook his head. It was Jiang Shangyu and Li Kuangtu. They launched a sneak attack after I left Mount Dibing. The situation was very dangerous at that time. If it weren't for Wushang, I would probably have died on the spot and couldn't even go back to Tianan. It was really dangerous, but this injury also helped me go further in martial arts and smoothly broke through. It was a blessing in disguise. Everyone came to their senses. Breakthrough. Li Tianlan broke through. This was a situation that all the forces in the world had not mastered in detail. Maybe some people would know that Li Tianlan had defeated Wang Xingxiao in Emperor Dong's palace, but no one could be sure that Li Tianlan had broken through. Such a breakthrough also meant invincible realm? Dongqing Wudi looked excited and expectant. The whole dark world knew that Li Tianlan's invincible realm was completely different from the regular invincible realm. Li Tianlan, who had not yet entered the invincible realm, could already fight against Jiang Shangyu and Li Kuangtu together. How strong would Li Tianlan be after successfully entering the invincible realm? A 24-year-old invincible realm expert, which even meant that the next few decades would belong to Li Tianlan. Such a long peak period was enough to make any enemy completely desperate. Li Tianlan nodded and smiled. His breakthrough this time was far more than just the invincible realm. Although the increase in combat capability did not meet expectations, it was only because he still had a lot of doubts in his heart. Apart from other things, if the second heart was exposed, it was almost enough to subvert some fields of biology. The interval between his second heartbeats was extremely long, but every beat was strengthening his body. The excessive vitality showed that the second heart beat twice in a day. Li Tianlan had a total of 2 nosebleeds, and the first time he even bled from the 7 orifices. This was still his regular state. In the state of combat, every beat of the second heart would instantly restore his physical strength to the peak state. It was no exaggeration to say that with the second heart, Li Tianlan's physical strength was almost endless. Even Wang Tianzong did not have this kind of breakthrough when he reached that supreme level. In some ways, it was not so much a breakthrough as an evolution. The evolution of life level. However, Li Tianlan himself did not know these things very well at present. Xianyuan Wushang knew something, but he could not say many things, so Li Tianlan could only use the word breakthrough to describe his current state. This is really good news. Zhou Mulin, who had the least contact with Li Tianlan, smiled. He looked at Li Tianlan with very soft eyes. Seeing you, I realize that I am really old, and I have to admit that I am old. Bai Zhanfang smiled. Wu Jingmin also smiled, and there was some meaning in his eyes. Chen Fangqing's death is not necessarily bad news. Xianyuan Wushang suddenly said. Several people turned their eyes to Xianyuan Wushang at the same time. Xianyuan Wushang smiled very kindly. He looked at Li Tianlan and said slowly, "Big brother, do you have any doubts in your heart?" "I'm not sure." Li Tianlan shook his head. When others were doubting him, he also had a highly suspicious target in his heart, but he was not sure who the target was. The academics, the special warfare group, the prince group, or even Chen Fangqing himself set him up at the cost of his life. All these were possible. "Are you suspecting that someone set you up for this?" Bai Qingzhao suddenly asked. As the eldest son of the Bai family and the backbone of the giant group, Bai Zhanfang would step down after this election and give up the position of Speaker of Yuzhou. This position was also the focus of all parties at present. When Bai Zhanfang stepped down and Bai Qingqian went to the new group, Bai Qingzhao would inevitably take over. His position was not completely determined at present, but it could basically be defined. Bai Qingzhao and Dongqing Wudi had a tacit understanding, so after the election, he would still stay in the army headquarters. It was necessary for him to enter the parliament. Obviously, it was not certain whether Bai Qingzhao would be the deputy minister of the army headquarters or the secretary general. This undoubtedly depended on the result of the game between all parties. But specifically within the group, Bai Qingzhao was already a member of parliament in the eyes of many people. If not, Bai Qingzhao would not participate in this kind of discussion. "It's really possible, isn't it?" Li Tianlan said slowly. "I always feel that Chen Fangqing's death is too coincidental. Well, I'm here so we can first rule out ourselves and then rule out the real coincidence. Then, someone must have done it secretly, not me. Who else could it be?" If that's the case, Dongqing Wudi's eyes were a little cold. The other party is really ruthless. His plot must be big. Is the position of the head of the cabinet enough? Wu Jingmin suddenly asked with a smile. This sentence was tantamount to saying that it was the academics who played tricks in the dark. Killing Chen Fangqing and framing the new group made the new group suffer a major setback. It had to compromise on some key issues and support Hua Jingyang to take over. At present, this was undoubtedly the most critical issue. President, Zhou Mulin recalled Li Huaqing and finally shook his head slightly. He doesn't look like a person who can do this kind of thing. Neither does Hua Jingyang. Zhou Mulin could be said to be the most low-key of the directors in Zhongzhou State. Even Zhou Yunhai, who had the weakest sense of existence, was more high-profile than him. Since Dongqing Wudi became a director 5 years ago, Zhou Mulin basically lived an early retirement life except for speaking out on some major issues. Although the old man kept a low profile, he was very accurate in judging people all his life and almost never made a mistake. His words at this time obviously did not agree with Wu Jingmin's inference. "Guo Wendian?" Bai Zhanfang suddenly asked. "He has the motive to do it, but he may not have the strength." Dongqing Wudi shook his head. "I heard that Guo Wendian spent some time alone with Chen Fangqing yesterday. The prince group is in a bad situation now. Chen Fangqing's death is easier to unite them against the common enemy." Bai Qingzhao said thoughtfully. "What about Chen Fangqing himself?" Li Tianlan suddenly said. Dongqing Wudi was stunned. Everyone was stunned. "You mean? Suicide?" Dongqing Wudi asked in a low voice. The study fell into silence. Everyone was thinking about this possibility. Chen Fangqing is not a good person. Li Tianlan said blandly, "But if he is a responsible prime minister, no one can refute it. I will kill him, but it doesn't mean that I don't approve of some of his characters. He has indeed devoted his life to Zhongzhou state. Ha! Li Tianlan suddenly sneered. He always called me a national thief. When he was at the end of his rope and in a desperate situation, he used his own life as the last bargaining chip to curb the development of the new group when he was unable to struggle. Isn't that his character? There was silence. After a long time, Bai Zhanfang sighed softly. That guy, no. Wu Jingmin said with certainty. He looked at Li Tianlan with a complicated look in his eyes. Finally, he smiled softly. What you said makes sense. He is indeed devoted to Zhongzhou state, but it is also because of this that Chen Fangqing is the least likely to commit suicide. His death can indeed curb the development of the new group to some extent, but it is more likely to cause the greatest chaos. Tianlan, you can't expect Chen Fangqing to know nothing about your character. If he really committed suicide, then he must know that you will not be reconciled. He knows how much power you have now. Your unwillingness will plunge Zhongzhou state into great chaos, which is definitely not what Chen Fangqing wants to see. He looked into Li Tianlan's eyes and said softly, he admitted his failure, so he will wait for you to kill him. After everything is settled, he will choose to let himself die in your hands to keep Zhongzhou state stable. In his view, this is the last thing he will do for Zhongzhou state. Li Tianlan sat there and was silent for a long time. Where is Chen Fangqing's body? Xianyuan Wushang suddenly asked. In the Chen family. It was sent from the Hidden Dragon Sea to the Chen family an hour ago. Zhongzhou state will release the official news in the evening at the latest. Let's go and have a look first. Xianyuan Wushang thought for a while and said slowly. When he spoke, his tone was very confident. Perhaps apart from him, only Li Tianlan knew how difficult it was to kill Chen Fangqing. Excluding the possibility of coincidence, there were not many people who could do this. As far as Xianyuan Wushang knew, only Li Tianlan and Xing Tian, who were in the neutral camp, could do this. But they could not do it. If it was not them, then there were only two directions. Either it was the Order, or the Shadow, Jiang Shangyu, Lin Shi. There were only two possibilities. And with their strength, if they did something, Xianyuan Wushang could not have missed it. Lin Shi must have known this. Therefore, Xianyuan Wushang had locked his suspicion on Jiang Shangyu. Because only Jiang Shangyu did not know the existence of him and Lin Shi. Only under such circumstances could Jiang Shangyu think that his move was flawless. As long as we really confirm the cause of Chen Fangqing's death and find out the inside story, then we can find out the person behind the scenes. For the new group, this is not a bad thing. Xianyuan Wushang smiled, and his voice became calmer. Li Tianlan suddenly glanced at him and said thoughtfully, Do you already have a suspect? Yes, but I'm not sure. Xianyuan Wushang said, I can tell you a piece of news. Before the decisive battle in Beihai, Jiang Shangyu and President Li Huaqing had a very secret communication. The specific content is unknown. Chapter 1082. Li Huaqing, Jiang Shangyu. Either of these two people was enough to attract the absolute attention of everyone present. When the two names were combined, the deterrence produced was definitely not as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. If the academics cooperated with Jiang Shangyu, the chemical reaction would be extremely amazing. Similarly, Li Tianlan was also very clear that such a possibility existed, and the probability was not low. At this moment, he suddenly remembered the conversation he had with Zhuang Huayang, the headmaster when he first entered the Sky Academy. A 10-year plan. At that time, Li Tianlan, who was far from amazing, was solemnly invited by Zhuang Huayang to join the academics in order to use 10 years to let Li Tianlan grow up and make up for some structural defects of the academics. The academics' shortcomings were not only that it had a short time to rise and did not establish close ties with some retired but influential old people. They also had a huge lack of voice in the dark world and the special warfare system. In this respect, it was indispensable within any group. What did the special warfare system and the dark world mean? To be precise, it meant a special power outside the rules. A high degree of freedom, even the power to act first and report later, and the characteristic of not being bound by ordinary laws. In any group, such a power could play a role that could not be ignored. The foundation of the academics in this respect was almost zero. Therefore, they always seemed to be very passive when playing with other groups. That was because they abided by the rules, and even if they wanted to break the rules, they had no bargaining chips to do so. The special warfare system was the order in the shadow of Xianxia state. From the perspective of Xianxia state, the darkness itself was a kind of order. Nearly 6 years ago, Li Tianlan, who was only the heir of the Li family at that time, attracted the personal attention of Li Huaqing. Li Huaqing instructed Zhuang Huayong to invite Li Tianlan to join the academics, and then facilitated the short-term cooperation between the giant group, the academy, the Samsara Palace, and the Li family. From this point alone, it could be seen how strong the academics' voice in the special warfare system and their desire for masters were. Li Tianlan's growth might have twists and turns, but on the whole, it was smooth. However, in a few years, the general trend changed, and Li Tianlan gradually drifted away from the academics. At this time, especially when the special warfare group was in turmoil, Jiang Shangyu and Li Huaqing secretly contacted each other. Did Li Huaqing intend to make Jiang Shangyu the core figure of the academics in the special warfare system? In contemplation, Bai Qingzhao was the first to speak. His tone was a little doubtful, but it was relatively soft. Mr. Xianyuan, you also said that this is a secret contact between the president and Jiang Shangyu. May I ask how you know about this? Xianyuan Wushang looked at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan nodded slightly, indicating that everyone present could be absolutely trusted. Xianyuan Wushang smiled and said softly, I can hack into the entire network of East Island, control their weapon systems, and enter their core database. Naturally, I can also enter the core database of Xianxia State to see something. In fact, although the network protection of Xianxia State is much more advanced than that of East Island, there is no qualitative change. I checked Li Huaqing's communication record and saw the conversation between him and Jiang Shangyu. The time was 26 minutes. Starting from this point, it's easy for me to investigate something. The only pity is that I don't know what exactly they talked about. There was dead silence in the study. 2 seconds later, Dongqing Wudi suddenly stood up and stared at Xianyuan Wushang with burning eyes. Everyone looked at his seemingly harmless smiling face. A dog that bites doesn't bark. Although there was something wrong with this description, they all had the same thought in their minds. Dongqing Wudi looked at the fat man in front of him seriously, as if he wanted to record his appearance in his mind. The way he looked at Xianyuan Wushang was strange and complicated. It was as if he was looking at a devil, an angel, or a nuclear bomb that could destroy the entire world, or something else. He could freely hack into the core database of Xianxia State and East Island, freely tamper with all the communications of a country, and freely control all the weapon systems. What did this mean? It was clear just by looking at East Island the night before. If what Xianyuan Wushang said was true, no, what he said was true. The 3 fleets of Murderous Bird, Giant Whale, and Black Dragon had now been incorporated by the Xianxia State Navy. For this matter, Dongqing Wudi talked with Li Huaqing for a long time. Although this matter hadn't been discussed in a parliamentary meeting, the general direction had been confirmed. These 3 fleets would be incorporated into the South Sea Fleet and become the strength of the new group in the Navy. The 3 fleets would be merged into an aircraft carrier fleet, and Li Tianlan would personally appoint the commander and be awarded the rank of lieutenant general. The 3 fleets and the slow response of East Island for a whole night were the embodiment of Xianyuan Wushang's real strength. Except for the fat man in front of him, no one knew what happened in East Island that night. In that state, East Island was in a state of war. All the communications were interacting with each other at a high frequency. The imperial family, the cabinet, the army ministry, all the major martial arts schools, the rear of East Island, the front of Beihai, the special warfare system, countless departments, and countless people were exchanging information at any time. In such a highly vigilant situation, Xianyuan Wushang easily got the control of all the weapon systems in East Island and controlled all the communication networks. In that state, there were countless phone calls communicating with each other every minute and every second. If one of the phone calls made people feel that something was wrong, the delicate but extremely fragile network that Xianyuan Wushang weaved would be completely broken. But under such circumstances, Xianyuan Wushang didn't have any accident, and everyone was completely fooled by the false communication. For East Island, this was a dream. In the dream, Xianyuan Wushang was an angel. When he woke up from the dream, Xianyuan Wushang directly turned into a devil. This kind of person, this kind of ability, should be respected and valued at the highest level in any country. When everyone was confused about East Island's behavior last night, the culprit showed up right beside them. It was him. He actually did it. If Zhongzhou State had such a person, Dongqing Wudi was a very arrogant person, but at the same time, he was also a person with extreme self-restraint. But when he saw Xianyuan Wushang and thought of East Island last night, even with his self-restraint, a logical idea directly popped up in his mind. With Xianyuan Wushang, Zhongzhou State could completely unify the whole world. What a ridiculous statement! What a crazy ambition! Unifying the whole world became the supreme will of hundreds of countries. This sounded inconceivable, but at this moment, it seemed so logical. Xianyuan Wushang could play East Island in the palm of his hand, which meant that the so-called top-secret and perfect firewalls of any country in Zhongzhou State, Star State, Snow Country, European land, or any other country in the world were useless in front of him. Hypothetically, under such circumstances, Zhongzhou State could completely invade without any scruples. Counterattack? There would be no such thing. When Xianyuan Wushang controlled the enemy's weapon system, the only counterattack the enemy could do was to use manpower and some guns. This level of control could even make all the high-tech weapons of the enemy turn around to attack their own country. To unify the whole world, Zhongzhou State would not even sacrifice the life of a soldier. It was so crazy, so absurd. Whether Zhongzhou State had such an idea or not, Dongqing Wudi was a soldier. A soldier's duty was not only to protect the country, but also to expand the territory. At this moment, Xianyuan Wushang in front of him was undoubtedly a treasure, which made him extremely surprised and terrified. Such an ability could indeed unify the whole world. But if there was really such a so-called unification, then did all this have anything to do with Zhongzhou State? Rather than saying that Zhongzhou State unified the world, it was better to say that Xianyuan Wushang unified the world alone. Such an ability was so obvious that it had nothing to do with Emperor Dong's palace. That kind of unscrupulous invasion was almost everywhere and impossible to guard against. In everyone's eyes, such a Xianyuan Wushang was both a devil and a god. Dongqing Wudi just looked at Xianyuan Wushang. There was a strong surprise in his eyes, and there was also undisguised cold-killing intent. No matter how strong Li Tianlan was, he was only one person after all. He might be able to fight against the whole world and hundreds of thousands of troops, but he was still one person. What he could guarantee was absolute domination in the dark world. Even if Li Tianlan was 100 times stronger, he could not destroy the whole world in an instant. Everyone would be afraid of him and would be afraid of him. The world could accommodate Li Tianlan. Xianyuan Wushang was different. Completely different. He had the ability to rule the world at will and destroy the world at will. Li Tianlan at least needed to draw his sword to kill. And he was just a simple invasion. He invaded Zhongzhou State, Snow Country, Star State, and any other country. With a bang, the world would be destroyed. What was this? What the hell was this? Such a person should not exist. His existence would be absolutely hostile and feared by everyone. If such a person's ability was exposed, the whole world would kill him at all costs, including Zhongzhou State. His existence made everyone feel that their life and death and future were all controlled by him. But in the face of that terrifying possibility, even Li Tianlan was a non-entity. Tianlan, can this person be trusted? Dongqing Wudi slowly turned his head to look at Li Tianlan, his eyes extremely solemn. Tianlan, kill him. Bai Zhanfang was silent for a long time before he slowly said. His tone was firm and tough. Kill. Wu Jingmin expressed his attitude without hesitation. No matter what, he has to die. Kill him. Zhou Mulin also said. Boundless killing intent completely surrounded Xianyuan Wushang. Xianyuan Wushang shrugged helplessly. He doesn't have this ability now. Li Tianlan shook his head and said the most important information. After a pause, he said again, "And he can be trusted." No one spoke. Li Tianlan frowned. Perhaps because he was facing his own people, he did not hide his dissatisfaction. "I said, he is my brother." Still silence. After a long time, Dongqing Wudi let out a long breath. His eyes were a little complicated. "How did you do it?" "It's a prop." Xianyuan Wushang smiled and said, "Or you can understand it as me using that prop to temporarily replace the network system of East Island and invade their core database." That prop instantly simulated and analyzed the information of every person recorded in East Island from countless files, and instantly simulated countless personalities. This kind of ability is really scary. In fact, it wasn't just the top officials of East Island who were affected that night. There were a total of 40 million calls in East Island that night, including phone calls, videos, emails, and texts. All of these were intercepted by the special intelligences simulated by that prop. But that prop's ability also reached its limit, so after the battle in Beihai, that prop was also destroyed. What he said was half true and half false. For example, that prop. If he hadn't appeared in front of Li Tianlan with virtual travel and taken Li Tianlan to do another virtual travel, Xianyuan Wushang's glasses wouldn't have been destroyed. That pair of glasses could have allowed Xianyuan Wushang to travel in every corner and scrupulously and invade every secret location at will. Simulating tens of millions of intelligences in an instant was nothing for that pair of glasses. It was nothing. But the truth was that the glasses were indeed destroyed, and Xianyuan Wushang really didn't have the ability that made everyone so afraid. The prop? The giants in the study looked at each other for a while. Where did that so-called prop come from? Wu Jingmin asked in a deep voice. Xianyuan Wushang didn't mind their aggressive attitude and said slowly, "It originally belonged to my sister. Later she gave it to me. For me, it's the most precious thing." "Where's your sister?" Zhou Mulin looked serious. Xianyuan Wushang was silent for a while, then said sadly, "She's dead." Dongqing Wudi looked at Xianyuan Wushang seriously. His intuition told him that Xianyuan Wushang wasn't lying. He breathed a sigh of relief but also felt a little pity. If it was just a prop, its value would be completely different. "What a pity," Wu Jingmin smiled and said, "that prop? If it could still be used, it would be enough to be the most important strategic weapon of the country. Even if it could only be used once, it would be a great deterrent. This kind of weapon makes everything developed by other countries meaningless. The more advanced the weapons they develop, the more advanced they create for themselves. Such a value can be said to be far greater than a murderous weapon." Xianyuan Wushang twitched the corner of his mouth. He subconsciously wanted to say that it was nonsense, but he held back. The murderous weapon of Miracle City was something he had always paid attention to, so he also knew some information. Obviously, when people here found King Wei, he was in an absolutely weak and seriously injured state. Even his consciousness was about to dissipate, leaving only a little instinct. With King Wei's particularity, in the real environment of Miracle City, his injury could only get worse and worse, without any possibility of recovery. The so-called hermit family that first found King Wei had been guarding his body. No one knew how many years had passed before the Wang family of Beihai destroyed the hermit family and found the prestige that was on the verge of death. Countless high-tech devices were used at the same time, and finally, King Wei's body and murderous weapon were barely decomposed, turning into the carefree and murderous weapon of today. At present, even if King Wei's body was reunited, he was still seriously injured and could die at any time. His power was completely incomparable to that of his heyday. But even so, once King Wei's body was reunited, his energy should be able to barely form a small circulation around Li Tianlan. With the supplement of Li Tianlan's sword energy, his energy could be self-sufficient. Its power was at least countless times stronger than that of ruthlessness at its peak. When Li Tianlan returned, King Wei in his heyday would be equivalent to the existence of the peak energy source. This was the only weapon that occupied the throne in the corridor of time and space over the incomparably long years. It was the weapon of the first emperor. If King Wei hadn't died with Li Tianlan, The current corridor of time and space might have been King Wei to take the position of King of War. Compared to King Wei, the little tool in front of him was nothing. Is there any more of such a prop? Bai Zhanfang asked slowly. Xianyuan Wushang shook his head. No. The giants all breathed a sigh of relief. Some were glad, but also disappointed. Their moods were extremely contradictory. That is to say, without that prop, no one in the world can invade it will like you, right? Dongqing Wudi asked. Xianyuan Wushang thought for a moment and grunted. Such people actually existed. The strength of Lin Shi's apostle was no less than that of his sister. If he did it himself, the effect would be many times better than that small prop. But he could indeed do it. Obviously, they were now being targeted by the eldest princess. Under such circumstances, the most he could do now was to search for information and occasionally use virtual shuttle to escape for his life. The dignified apostle, whose destructive power was almost invincible among his peers, could only escape for his life and search for information. The corners of Xianyuan Wushang's mouth curled up slightly. He was somewhat gloating. That's the end of this matter. Dongqing Wudi said slowly, Tianlan, don't publicize this matter. It can't be explained clearly. As long as he is around you, it will cause others to be afraid, which is not a good thing. No one will believe that he can only use that ability once. As long as he is around, you will be in trouble. Such a person is a real devil in the eyes of his opponents, but in the eyes of his own people, he is equivalent to an angel. Once this kind of trouble is publicized, it may cause very bad results. Devil, angel, Xianyuan Wushang laughed. In fact, my greatest wish is to be an angel. Unfortunately, at least so far, I haven't seen any hope of becoming an angel. Bai Zhanfang obviously didn't like Xianyuan Wushang. Seeing that the fat man was serious, he snorted and said grumpily, Why don't you say you want to be a god? God is the human definition of a powerful creature beyond the scope of understanding. This term is strictly abstract. In a sense, it doesn't exist. Even if it exists, a god may not be stronger than an angel. So you recognize an angel, but refuse to recognize a god. Li Tianlan suddenly added. No one else spoke. Instead, they looked at the two of them as if they were looking at a mentally disabled child. Xianxia state had always been a country of atheists. I'm just against the term God. I don't deny certain powers. Angel is just a title. As for a god, I agree with it. But even if it really exists, it shouldn't be called a god. It should be a superconsciousness that is above everything and creates all things. It's something we can't see. Specifically, we have another name for those who are like gods and have absolute power. It's about truth and irreplaceable. We call them. Xianyuan Wushang smiled and said softly, Master. Chapter 1083. On the way to the Chen family, the vehicles that set off from the Bai family's manor formed a row of majestic motorcade. The cars chosen by Dongqing Wudi, Zhou Mulin, Bai Zhanfang, and Wu Jingmin were all black flags specially made for leaders in Zhongzhou state. Li Tianlan's car was given to him by the master of Samsara Palace in the year of the chaos in Snow Country. It was a custom-made Rolls-Royce, which was the only one in the world. Now it became Li Tianlan's car in Yuzhou. 5 cars lined up neatly in the front and back, surrounded by 4 escort cars, all of them Audis, quietly protecting the car in the middle. At the front, there were 2 police cars for clearing the way. At this time, including the route from the Bai family to the Chen family, according to the traffic situation in Yuzhou, without police cars clearing the way, they might have to walk until the afternoon. Xianyuan Wushang was still Li Tianlan's driver. He held the steering wheel and seemed to be a little curious about this means of transportation. You haven't driven before? Li Tianlan asked in surprise. He had long noticed Xianyuan Wushang's curiosity about cars, but this interest lasted from the hotel to the Bai family's manor, and then from the manor to here. Li Tianlan couldn't help but despise him. Bumpkin. Indeed, I haven't driven before. Xianyuan Wushang sighed with emotion. I haven't even seen this thing before. It's too heavy, and it even needs to hold the steering wheel to control the direction. Tut, it's an antique among antiques. If it were here, someone would definitely pay a lot of money to collect it. There was one thing that Xianyuan Wushang didn't say. Anything that came from Miracle City, not to mention a car, even a handful of soil had great research value. What's your means of transportation? Li Tianlan asked casually. He had always thought that the group behind Xianyuan Wushang should be a hidden force living in a corner of a country on Earth. Maybe it was Africa, or the west of subcontinent, or somewhere else. Isolated from the world, they developed countless black technologies and discovered countless secrets. They closed themselves off from the world and rarely communicated with outsiders. But looking at it now, it didn't seem to be the case at all. No matter how little he interacted with outsiders, he should have seen a car before. Even if he hadn't, he should have seen a similar tractor. Xianyuan Wushang's curiosity about this luxurious vehicle wasn't because he was looking at something advanced. His gaze was more like he was admiring an ancient antique, just like how a modern person would look at a chariot from the Pre-Qin dynasty. He was full of interest, but it was just an interest in collecting. Li Tianlan's expression was somewhat stiff. He could understand this interest, so naturally, he could also understand the other meaning behind this interest. Even in modern times, not everyone liked antiques. Xianyuan Wushang had this kind of interest, so he liked this Rolls-Royce very much. It was like a normal person facing a bronze chariot with thousands of years of history. The only thought in their mind was, what the F***ck is this rubbish? It's a pile of scrap metal. So backward? Backward? So, were they the bumpkins in Xianyuan Wushang's eyes? We can use virtual shuttle to temporarily turn ourselves into data. In the later stage of the development of the quantum network, it is extremely compatible without any lag. The data stream that can be accommodated is beyond everyone's imagination. If we turn ourselves into data, we can go anywhere regardless of distance. Why do we need to use a car? Xianyuan Wushang said with a smile. Li Tianlan was a little dissatisfied and didn't believe it. Is something like virtual shuttle as common as bicycles in your world? This kind of technology is high-end anyway. Even if it's ordinary, the so-called quantum network should be your main communication channel, right? Just like the current internet, it turns people into data. If the data is turned into data by a super hacker, can he take advantage of the opportunity of turning himself into data to invade the inside of your quantum network? Don't you have any precautions for such a shuttle? It's not that exaggerated. Xianyuan Wushang smiled. But we do have precautions. Even in our world, virtual shuttle is a very high-end technology. But for me and the people around me, we can use it at any time. As for most people, Xianyuan Wushang thought for a moment and said, they don't use cars either. His eyes suddenly lit up. Big brother, I remember a few movies here. There's a guy who claims to be comparable to God with a mortal body. His equipment, to a certain extent, is close to our normal means of transportation. If you like, I can get a set of advanced cutting-edge armor, but it's a little troublesome and takes some time. Li Tianlan thought for a moment, not sure which movie Xianyuan Wushang was talking about. After a while, he found one that barely matched. You mean the Revenge Alliance? Xianyuan Wushang was a little confused. Iron Man? What's the difference? Isn't it just a role? Li Tianlan said grumpily, but his eyes were a little dazed. He had seen the whole series of movies and most of the derivatives mentioned by Xianyuan Wushang, but he had watched them with the company of another woman he hadn't heard from for a long time. Wang Yuetong was a die-hard fan of this series of movies. Li Tianlan glanced at them, but the two of them were not very interested in the rich man in iron armor who could fly in the sky and travel underground. Li Tianlan didn't have any special feelings for anyone, but Wang Yuetong admired the captain very much. Li Tianlan thought for a moment and asked, your means of transportation is iron armor? We call it a single mecha. Xianyuan Wushang smiled. It has nothing to do with steel. It's a strong interaction material. It can be used as a single person's means of transportation, and it can also be used to arm a small elite army for battle. Well, this kind of thing, I don't think I can carry it. He thought about it seriously and confirmed his idea again. Only a few super-large elite legions would be able to mass-produce individual mechas made of materials with strong interaction forces, making them look like normal equipment. However, even in the space-time corridor, this material was a strategic large-scale military resource. It was a strategic material that could be used for many purposes. All of them were made of protons and neutrons that were completely locked together by strong interaction forces. The surface was absolutely smooth, the temperature was at absolute zero, and it would reflect all electromagnetic waves. Its surface was indestructible, and it had an absolutely strong bearing capacity that far surpassed nanotechnology. This material was not only used to make individual mechas, but it was also one of the main materials used to seal the stars. And the so-called sealing a star, from the perspective of the people on Earth, was the so-called celestial giant structure project. To put it simply, it was the Dyson sphere in the concept of the people here. According to Xianyuan Wuxiang's understanding of Miracle City, there was currently nothing in any country in the world that could cause the slightest damage to such a mecha. Of course, this so-called nothing didn't include the complete King Wei. If such a mecha was the military version of the time corridor, it was usually equipped with a warp speed engine, image memory system, super thinking system, all-around armed control system, energy conversion resonance system, force field control system, infrasound weapon system, dark matter cannon, and the conventional version of the Star Destroyer cannon. This also meant that such a mecha didn't even need to be operated in the internal space. In the state of superthinking, just the mecha itself could carry out long-distance superluminal cruising and fixed-point teleportation. With the current level of development on Earth, even if Earth developed for 1,000 years, it would still be impossible to face such a mecha alone. Such a mecha could easily penetrate the entire Earth in its absolute speed, as simple as a bullet piercing through a piece of tofu. And any of the weapons equipped on the mecha itself could directly destroy the surface of the entire Earth in just a few dozen seconds. Such a mecha, whether in the time corridor, the God of War's realm, or the human emperor's palace, had a unified name. The code name was Calamity. With Xianyuan Wuxiang's identity as the 9th prince and a member of the Pinnacle Palace in the time corridor, there was no problem at all for him to get a Calamity mecha. But the point was that if this thing didn't go through special treatment, it would be like a locator in Miracle City, attracting countless malicious eyes. He drove the car, his eyes flashing for a while, but he didn't say anything. Li Tianlan looked at him expressionlessly. So, when you said you would get me a set just now, you were just making fun of me? No, I didn't. Xianyuan Wuxiang smiled. I don't have the means to deal with those troublesome things. After all, I'm just a doctor. But I should be able to find someone to get a set for you. Of course, it should be a collectible without weapons and various systems, with only basic navigation capabilities. It's not troublesome. It was indeed not troublesome. He didn't have such a mecha, and neither did Xing Tian. But Lin Shi did. To be exact, it was the apostle next to Lin Shi who had won. He was one of the oldest apostles in the time corridor. If his sister hadn't died, even if he was stronger than him, there would be a limit. How many Calamity mechas did the apostles have? Judging from the size of his sister's army at that time. This type of Calamity grade fully armed and equipped with different weapons to form a complete set of combat systems, in the hands of the apostles, would be counted in the hundreds of millions. That was the most conservative estimate. If it weren't for the restrictions of the real environment of Miracle City and the eyes of Princess Royal, when the apostles completely released their army, the number of Calamity mechas alone would be more than the total population of Miracle City. And the number of his other armies would be dozens of times more than that. Omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. As the pinnacle of the Order camp, this was the position that the human clan was currently at the limit of this path. It crushed everything at the same level, with the highest lethality and destruction. This was the Apostle of Destruction. It's not bad to get a set to play with. Li Tianlan nodded and said. He wasn't very interested in the mecha himself. It only had basic navigation ability, which meant that it couldn't even be compared to the state in the movies, not to mention the complete state of the mecha. With Li Tianlan's current strength, his physical strength was completely endless. The second heart could support him to squander the power of his dual wind and thunder veins unscrupulously. If Li Tianlan rushed from Yuzhou to Tianan Xianyuan City at full speed, Even without Ruthless, it would take him no more than 3 hours on foot. During this time, Li Tianlan even had time to smoke a few cigarettes. This was not Li Tianlan's limit in the future, but it was already the limit of martial arts in the entire Dark World. But if he gave this mecha to Qin Weibai, she would probably like it very much. I'll get it for you after a while, big brother. Xianyuan Wushang laughed. Li Tianlan nodded carelessly. He had been thinking about the problem that Xianyuan Wushang had just mentioned. Their group didn't recognize God. Their disapproval was not a denial of the existence of God. They were just a simple denial of the word. They denied it. They believed that angels stood side by side with the so-called God. As for the power that the gods represented in their minds, they referred to it as Lord. But this was a very profound title. Li Tianlan thought of the Bible. This word often appeared in the Bible. There was a Bible in his bedroom. Qin Weibai was an extremely devout believer. She occasionally prayed, but she didn't go to church. She disdained the Holy Land, but Li Tianlan could clearly feel her devoutness and tranquility. Did the so-called Lord that Xianyuan Wushang mentioned also mean this? If this was really what he meant, then Lord really existed? What is Lord? Li Tianlan suddenly asked. He had realized that Xianyuan Wushang could say a lot of things, but he couldn't say a lot of things. It depended on how Li Tianlan asked. At least the so-called mecha had already surpassed most people's understanding of technology, and then it made Li Tianlan's thoughts shift to another direction that he felt was a little absurd, a little fake, but it was also very true. Xianyuan Wushang hesitated for a moment, then said softly and quickly, "It's the authority." There were only 3 words in this short sentence. If he deliberately sped up, it would take him less than half a second. But what Li Tianlan heard was a chaotic noise. The malice of the world was boiling in Xianyuan Wushang's body, destroying countless cells in his body and sucking away the vitality of a large number of organs. Xianyuan Wushang's face turned pale for a moment, but there was a touch of eternal pride and arrogance in his eyes that seemed to be eternal and would never yield. Does it have anything to do with the Bible? Li Tianlan took a deep look at him and asked from another angle. Xianyuan Wushang was silent for a long time and didn't speak. The Rolls-Royce drove steadily on the road of Yuzhou, followed by Wu Jingmin's Hongqi. When the motorcade drove through a bustling street, Xianyuan Wushang let out a muffled groan and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. He shook his head slowly and said, "No, it has nothing to do with the Bible. The Lord in the Bible, we prefer to call it the superconsciousness, which is beyond the scope of everyone's understanding. The Lord I'm talking about is like my father and..." He glanced at Li Tianlan and added the second half of the sentence in his heart, "as well as you and Qin Weibai." These things are very interesting. Li Tianlan thought silently. After thinking for a long time, he slowly opened his mouth and said, "Interesting." Xianyuan Wushang laughed. His smile was a little bright and a little sad. "It's really interesting, of course it's interesting. To fight with heaven and earth, to stand side by side with heaven and earth, to be the enemy of the world. Survival, no matter when, is the most important thing." Xianyuan Wushang murmured to himself. Everyone is trying to survive. This is instinct. Li Tianlan looked at him quietly. "Instinct, ha? Instinct, ha?" Xianyuan Wushang suddenly laughed wildly. He turned his head and looked at Li Tianlan seriously. "Big brother, do you have a goal?" "What do you mean?" Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows slightly. "It's a goal, an ideal, a dream. Whatever you say, it's a height you've been pursuing but haven't reached for the time being." Xianyuan Wushang repeated it very seriously. "Goal, ideal, dream," Li Tianlan murmured to himself. After a full 2 minutes, he smiled and said, "There should be. I have a lot of goals. A lot. His voice seemed to become soft. "When I was very young, my biggest goal was to be able to eat meat for every meal and let my grandfather drink wine for every meal. When I was a little older, I hoped that I could become strong quickly and walk out of the Li family's camp. When I was a little older, I began to pursue the invincible realm. I hoped to reach that realm as soon as possible, because only when I reached that realm could I protect the Li family. When I walked out of the border and met Wang Tianzong, my goal was to be invincible in the world. I wanted to lead the Li family to surpass the previous peak and stand at the highest place. Well, Li Tianlan smiled and said, that's probably my goal now. Now I can be said to be invincible, but it's not absolute. And the Li family, we don't stand at the highest place. Good goal. Xinyuan Wushang smiled, but there was no smile in his voice. I mean, big brother, if you know that your goal is right in front of you, but you can't succeed no matter what, and you can only work in vain again and again, what will you do? His voice was steady and soft. Li Tianlan raised his head and quietly looked at the little fat man in his sight. There was no expression on his chubby face, but there was a touch of sadness that couldn't be concealed in his eyes. It went deep into his bones. I will persist. Li Tianlan was silent for a long time before he slowly opened his mouth and said, yes, persist. Xinyuan Wushang said softly, we are also persisting. So, what's your goal? Li Tianlan asked calmly. Survival. Xinyuan Wushang smiled and said, that's our biggest goal. Unfortunately, we're about to fail again. Chapter 1084. For the arrival of Li Tianlan and Dongqing Wudi, although the Chen family tried their best to hide something, they still inadvertently showed strong hostility and great fear. The Chen family's residence was not too far from the city center. It was a Chinese-style garden covering an area of less than 20 acres. It used to be the mansion of a prime minister of the previous dynasty, which matched Qin Fangqing's identity. It was said that Qin Fangqing fell in love with it at first sight. When he was the deputy prime minister, he brought his family here and built the prime minister's mansion into an antique but modern and comfortable Yuan Lin. About 7 years ago, the mansion was bought by Haoyue Group for 1.2 billion yuan. With such an area, the history of the mansion, and the fact that it was in Yuzhou, the price was not too high, but Yuzhou did not suffer a loss. Chen Fangqing's body was currently parked in the main hall of the mansion. When Li Tianlan and the others rushed over, a large number of people came out to greet them. What was rare was that except for Qin Fangqing, the other 8 directors were in Yuzhou. Dongqing Wudi and Zhou Mulin were with Li Tianlan. The remaining 6, including Li Huaqing, all appeared in Li Tianlan's sight at this time. But the one walking in the center was not Li Huaqing. It was a middle-aged man in his early 40s. He looked a little like Qin Fangqing. He was slightly fat and wore a pair of glasses. At this time, he was wearing morning clothes. His eyes were a little numb from the pain, and he even looked a little sluggish. Obviously, he had not reacted to the news of Qin Fangqing's sudden death. When shaking hands with Li Tianlan, his arm trembled violently. The almost numb pain seemed to become active the moment he saw Li Tianlan. The pain was changing, mixed with deep resentment and fear. At this moment, he looked like he was going to pounce on Li Tianlan and bite him to death at any time. But in the end, he dared not do anything. He even quietly lowered his head to hide his eyes. Li Tianlan glanced at him, narrowed his eyes, and remained calm. He naturally knew the man in front of him. After Qin Fangqing, he could basically be regarded as the pillar of the entire Chen family. This was Qin Fangqing's biological son and also Qin Fangqing's successor in Zhongzhou State, Qin Shi. A year ago, he was just transferred to be the governor of Nanyun Province. This year, he had just turned 38 years old. Standing in this position, it could be said that he had a bright future. Moreover, he was transferred to this position a year ago, which was enough to prove Qin Fangqing's good intentions. The election was only about a year away. After the election, whether Qin Fangqing retires or not, the major groups will adjust their existing personnel. Some people will be promoted, some people will be demoted, some people will leave, and some people will stay. Before and after the election, it has always been a time of turbulence. Chen Shi was placed in the position of president a year ago. After the election, just after the red line of 2 years, the Prince Group can completely let Chen Shi take a step forward, leave Nanyun, and become the speaker of a province. What was Chen Shi's position in the Prince Group? Judging from his age and position, it was obvious at a glance. Nowadays, Zhou Yuanshan, who was the focus of attention in the new group and was even considered to be very likely to become the president in 10 or 20 years, was 38 years old this year and served as the speaker of Xianxia province. In the southeast group, Wang Jingxin, who was almost as famous as Zhou Yuanshan, was 36 years old this year and served as the governor of Jianghuai province. Chen Shi was 38 years old this year and served as the speaker of Nanyun province. If everything went well, then after the election, as soon as Chen Fangqing came down, or even before Chen Fangqing retired, Chen Shi's position would change again. Combined with the current personnel structure of the Prince Group, Chen Shi was likely to go to Tianfu province to serve as the speaker, embarking on the road to heaven that Chen Fangqing had walked before, from Tianfu to the southwest, entered the parliament, and finally competed with Zhou Yuanshan, Wang Jingxin, and others for the position of several directors. Zhou Yuanshan, Wang Jingxin, Chen Shi, for such people, if there were no major accidents, their path was destined to be smooth sailing. Perhaps there would be challenges, perhaps there would be setbacks, there would be ups and downs, but in the end, they would all reach a dazzling position. What they were fighting for was only a matter of ranking. But now, the big accident really happened. If Chen Fangqing didn't die, even if he retired early, it wouldn't be a big problem. The Chen family might suffer heavy losses, Chen Fangqing's reputation might be ruined, but the Prince Group would certainly protect Chen Shi. His current position and qualifications were perfect. That was the perfection that the Prince Group had spent countless resources to pave. He was one of the core successors of the large group, and now he had reached the position of the provincial speaker, which meant that the internal management of the group couldn't give up on him, nor would they allow him to stumble, because the group didn't have enough time and resources to cultivate other successors. So as long as Chen Fangqing was still there, even if he didn't have any position, Chen Shi would be able to stabilize his position. 1 year later, he would go to Tianfu, and 6 years later, he would enter the southwest, and the Chen family would once again restore its former glory. But Chen Fangqing died. Very suddenly, without the slightest sign, died inexplicably, and left people at a loss. Chen Shi didn't believe that his father's death was an accident. He spoke to his father on the phone yesterday afternoon after receiving the news of the decisive battle in North Sea. At that time, Chen Fangqing's heart was suppressing great unwillingness and anger, but his attitude was still positive. He had always been in good health. How could he die in less than a day? Li Tianlan. It could only be Li Tianlan. It could only be the new group. Whether or not Chen Shi was rational enough, whether or not he could see that the new group's action at this time was extremely disadvantageous to their own situation, Chen Shi always believed that Li Tianlan killed his father. Because this was the only possible explanation. Since it was the only one, then no matter how absurd it was, the only one was the truth. The moment he saw Li Tianlan, Chen Shi's whole body suddenly fell into great hatred and rage, but when he saw Li Tianlan's eyes, all the hatred and rage seemed to be frozen. The other's eyes were calm and indifferent, like a basin of cold water without the slightest temperature, freezing all the blood in his body in an instant. Fear, coldness seeped in completely, into his bone marrow. Only then did Chen Shi remember his identity. Or rather, he remembered his position. His position was the governor of Nanyun province. Nanyun province. Nanyun province was next to Tianan. The rapid development of Xianyuan city in the past 2 years was inseparable from the funds of Emperor Dong's palace and the support of the Flourishing Age Fund hidden behind the scenes at that time. But this was not all. Many plans needed to be discussed in the parliament. Among the large quantities of materials, some of them were strictly controlled. It was not that the Flourishing Age Fund and Emperor Dong's palace could not provide these things, but if they wanted to build a city with the plan of building a province first, they needed all kinds of materials, and they had to rely on the support of Zhongzhou state. All the materials had to pass through Nanyun province. And the materials for Xianyuan city were also prepared by Nanyun province first. For more than 2 years, the Prince Group and the academics kept chasing the Southeast Group and the Giant Group, and at the same time, they constantly put pressure on Emperor Dong's palace and the Wang family of Beihai. As the son of Chen Fangqing, Chen Shi sat in the unique position of Nanyun province. It was completely imaginable what his attitude towards Emperor Dong's palace and what he had done. At least, Chen Shi had secretly heard some rumors. More than one high-level official of Emperor Dong's palace had expressed their attitude that they would kill him sooner or later. At the very least, Chen Shi was on the blacklist of Emperor Dong's palace. If Chen Fangqing had not died, he would have become the master of Heaven's palace 1 year later. Naturally, he would not be afraid of this. But now Chen Fangqing suddenly died. At this moment, Chen Shi finally realized that his position as the successor of the group had been greatly shaken. There were two paths in front of him. One was negative, and the other was positive. The negative response was naturally to do nothing, expect the counterattack of the group, expect Emperor Dong's palace to fall apart, or expect Li Tianlan to let the Qin family go under pressure. Strictly speaking, Li Tianlan did not have any hatred towards the prince group. The outcome of the game was at most a matter of gratitude and resentment, but not hatred. If he lost the game this time, he would naturally have a chance to get it back next time. All his killing intent was concentrated on Chen Fangqing. Today's plunder and suppression of the prince group, strictly speaking, had little to do with Li Tianlan's personal will, but the basic demand of the rise of the new group. This demand, in the analysis of many people, could overwhelm everything. Chen Fangqing's death undoubtedly put great pressure on Li Tianlan. Perhaps under pressure, for the sake of the new group, he might not do anything to the Qin family. In this way, through the most difficult period, Chen Shi thought that he could rely on his father's death to regain his footing. On this path, the only thing he could expect was that Li Tianlan would let the Chen family go because of the excessive pressure. The positive path was the complete opposite. That was to use the news of his father's death to exert his influence to the extreme and run around. Now the prince group was like a powder keg that would explode at the slightest touch. Everyone had a fire in their hearts that they had nowhere to vent. If he came forward, he was 90% sure that he could completely unite the majority of the forces of the prince group in the shortest time. This force might not be led by him, but it was definitely aimed at Li Tianlan. This was also the situation that the academics hoped to see. Once he did this, the academics would respond to his actions as soon as possible. At that time, the Special Warfare Group and the Southeast Group might join in. They would target Dongqing Wudi, Li Tianlan, and the group behind them and make them make all kinds of compromises. It was easy to succeed on this path. And the so-called success was just to make Li Tianlan compromise. Chen Shi was not sure how far he could make Li Tianlan compromise and not target the Chen family. And once he did so, as the source of all things, the Chen family would inevitably incur stronger hatred from the whole Emperor Dong's palace. This also meant that on this path he would directly stand at the forefront, on the opposite side of the young Emperor Dong, and directly challenge his majesty. Yes, it was majesty. Chen Shi felt that it was not too much to use this word to describe Li Tianlan. In the eyes of many, he was the heavenly son. In the eyes of certain people, he was a child. In the eyes of Qin Weibai, he was her husband. In the eyes of the people of Emperor Dong's palace, he was his majesty. But in the eyes of all the enemies of Li Tianlan today, the current Li Tianlan was invincible. Invincible in the world, naturally, his majesty was irresistible. Chen Shi wanted to take this path, but he had asked himself countless times, and he still did not feel that he had the courage to stand in front of Li Tianlan. Moreover, even if he really did so, Chen Shi was not sure how many people would speak up for him if Li Tianlan insisted on destroying the Qin family, even if he compromised on a lot of things. As long as Li Tianlan was willing to compromise and give up some resources, then the prince group would have the possibility to choose a new successor. Although it was only a possibility and not an opportunity, it was better than nothing. Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace had grown to this extent. For the prince group, naturally, they wanted to get rid of them as soon as possible. But for the Southeast group and the academics, they were happy to suppress the new group and Emperor Dong's palace. But if they wanted to destroy Emperor Dong's palace and the new group, these two groups would definitely retreat faster than anyone else. Therefore, Li Tianlan would always have a position at the top of Zhongzhou state. Many people would suppress him. Li Tianlan would also compromise, but no matter how he compromised, he had to find a target to vent his anger. At that time, when everything was settled, the Chen family would undoubtedly be the most suitable target to be sacrificed. And such a thing was also the most likely. Xianxia did not dare to do so. But if he continued to wait passively, what would happen after Li Tianlan passed the most difficult period? At that time, the strength of the Prince Group would be greatly damaged. Xianxia was one of the successors of the Prince Group, but not the only one. With the scale of the Prince Group, it was enough to train 2 future directors of Zhongzhou State, and Xianxia was just one of them. Just one of them. When the strength of the Prince Group was greatly damaged, in a short time, it was impossible for them to replace both successors. Therefore, giving up one and fully supporting the other was the most rational behavior. Xianxia would also be given up. Just before and after the election. He would also leave Nanyun. But instead of going to Tianfu, he would go to Yuzhou and be given an idle position. After a few years, when no one paid attention to him, Emperor Dong's palace would also attack him. Xianxia suddenly found that he had no choice. No matter what choice he made, the Chen family seemed to be facing a dead end. Resentment, unwillingness, fear, coldness, all the emotions turned into a huge pressure, crushing Xianxia's spine. He held Li Tianlan's hand stiffly, and he did not realize that he had bent down. And in his eyes, there was also a flash of hatred. A vague voice sounded in his ear. It was Li Tianlan's voice, faint, without any emotion, no apparent pain, no apparent pleasure. I'm sorry, for the whole Zhongzhou state, the death of the Prime Minister is a huge loss. The voice became more and more vague. Xianxia could not hear it clearly. He held Li Tianlan's hand, and his body shook. At noon, in the sky full of snow, his body fell heavily to the ground. Call an ambulance, someone fainted. The Chen family was in a mess, and some staff began to make calls. In the noisy atmosphere, Li Tianlan shook hands with everyone in the Chen family in turn. He was expressionless. No one in the Chen family had the courage to look into his eyes. Li Tianlan shook hands with everyone in the Chen family coldly, expressing his condolences. Li Huaqing and other counselors just watched quietly. To some extent, such condolences were a demonstration. Li Huaqing and Hua Jingyang kept their composure. On the side, Guo Wentian's eyes flashed with a blazing and angry light. Zhou Yunhai kept his composure. Wan Qingyun and Ji Wenzhang's eyes flickered, and no one knew what they were thinking. Dong Qingwudi and Zhou Mulin walked in front of Li Tianlan calmly, as if they did not notice Li Tianlan's posture behind them. Until he shook hands with a nephew of Qin Fangqing, Li Tianlan casually shook his hand. A few sword intents rose out of thin air and froze into ice in Li Tianlan's hand. The water drops had been evaporated by the high temperature before they fell from his hand. This blatant action of washing hands embarrassed everyone in the Chen family to the extreme. All the counselors were watching this scene, and no one spoke. They all knew what Li Tianlan's action meant. This was tantamount to telling them a problem. The Chen family's business was not over. Was this an expression of determination? Li Huaqing sighed in his heart, looked at Li Tianlan, who walked in front of him, and reached out to shake hands with him. It's too sudden. Li Tianlan said. Yes, no one was prepared. The Prime Minister has always been very healthy. I just checked the data records of the healthcare doctor for the past 6 months. The Prime Minister's blood pressure has only been slightly high in recent months. Who knows? Li Huaqing shook his head, and his eyes were a little complicated. Is this an accident? Li Tianlan looked into Li Huaqing's eyes and asked. Li Huaqing paused slightly and did not speak. This question was too direct. If he said it was not an accident, that meant that he thought Qin Fangqing's death was a murder. If he said it was an accident, that meant that in his attitude, this matter had nothing to do with Li Tianlan. No matter what he said, it was not appropriate for Li Huaqing. The forensic doctor is still studying, and it's not clear at the moment. Li Huaqing said vaguely. Li Tianlan nodded. Where's the Prime Minister's body? I also brought a doctor, maybe he can draw some conclusions. Oh. Li Huaqing glanced at Li Tianlan with some playfulness. It's not against the law to look at the body, is it? Li Tianlan said faintly and waved his hand. Xianyuan Wushang, who was walking at the back, slightly quickened his pace and stood beside Li Tianlan. Li Huaqing hesitated and nodded. "Follow me." Li Huaqing said yes, said goodbye to the other directors, and went directly to the main hall. Chen Fengqing's body was lying on a bed, covered all over. Xianyuan Wushang glanced at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan nodded. Xianyuan Wushang took 2 steps forward and casually lifted the cover on the body. Chen Fengqing's eyes were closed, and he looked very peaceful. If you didn't look at the color of his skin, he looked like he was asleep. With his back to Li Tianlan and Li Huaqing, Xianyuan Wushang narrowed his eyes. There was an incomparably pure light flowing in his eyes, as if he had seen through everything. The light in his eyes became brighter and brighter. His pupils slowly narrowed, but the expression on his face began to become doubtful. The doubt slowly became dignified and serious, and finally turned into a touch of fear and dread. He stared at Chen Fengqing for almost 5 minutes. He put down the cover again. "How is it?" Li Tianlan, who had been standing there chatting with Li Huaqing and couldn't do anything else, asked casually. "Nothing unexpected." Xianyuan Wushang was silent for a long time, and then slowly said, "It's a natural death." No one could see his expression. Obviously, this was not the truth. But this was the only thing Xianyuan Wushang could know. From Chen Fengqing's body, he could vaguely feel that something was wrong. This feeling was vague, but his instinct told him that such a death was definitely not a normal death. But the problem was, Xianyuan Wushang knew that it was not a normal death, but he didn't know how abnormal it was. He didn't know at all. Chapter 1085. No one believed Xianyuan Wushang's words. Just like the forensic doctor's conclusion that Chen Fengqing died of natural causes, no one believed it either. Such a death was too coincidental, and there were great benefits behind such a coincidence. So even if it was a natural death, some people tried to turn it into a conspiracy. Xianyuan Wushang was a doctor, but he was unknown and had no authority to prove it. In the eyes of others, his so-called natural death was just a formality that Li Tianlan had brought a person here to go through the motions and give the conclusion of natural death. People didn't even believe that Xianyuan Wushang was a doctor. This conclusion couldn't stand scrutiny, and no one would believe it at all. But at the very least, Li Tianlan had to show his attitude. As the new group became more and more clear, and people kept changing their positions under the influence of the Flourishing Age Fund, Li Tianlan's attitude could be said to be unimportant, but it could also be said to be very important. But on the scene, no one showed any doubt about Xianyuan Wushang, even those from the Chen family. There was an endless stream of people from the Chen family who came to mourn. After all, he was the prime minister of a country. No matter how down and out he was, ordinary people couldn't compare with him. And now most of the people who could get the news were well informed. They could know about Chen Fengqing's death, and naturally, they could see some possible developments after Chen Fengqing's death. At this time, no one wanted to offend Li Tianlan, and naturally no one wanted to offend Chen Fengqing. Anyway, it was just a trip, and no one thought it was troublesome. On such an occasion, other directors of Zhongzhou State had to show up, but it was not suitable for them to be watched for a long time. So Li Huaqing took the initiative to borrow a side hall from the Chen family and prepared to hold a temporary meeting on the spot. When talking to the Chen family, Li Huaqing's expression and voice were very calm. But Li Tianlan, Dongqing Wudi, and Zhou Mulin all took a deep look at him. Meeting in the Chen family. Everyone knew what it meant. The Chen family was not far from the Hidden Dragon Sea. Under normal circumstances, even if there was a meeting, it should be held in the Hidden Dragon Sea. In fact, they had nothing else to do here. There was no need to stay here after showing up. Chen Fengqing's death was sudden and special. In the past 100 years, he was the first director to pass away before he even retired. Therefore, all the counselors would show up. All the counselors in Yuzhou and the powerhouses of the military headquarters would come here. In the next 3 days, all the counselors in Zhongzhou State would come to Yuzhou and wait for Chen Fengqing's funeral. If Chen Fengqing had already retired, the directors would also come before the official funeral. However, they would not appear at the same time. In fact, not all of them would appear. They would ask the secretary to help maintain the order at the scene. They would only attend the funeral ceremony for Chen Fengqing's remains. So, strictly speaking, after the appearance, all the directors had nothing to do. It was enough to leave 2 secretaries to assist the Qin family. They could come again during the funeral ceremony 3 days later. But now, Li Huaqing requested to have a meeting at the Qin family. Was it because the meeting was so urgent that they couldn't even make it from here to the Hidden Dragon Sea, which was less than 20 kilometers away? That was obviously not the case. This was gaining the upper hand by a show of strength. The high-level meeting held in the Qin family had a rich meaning, and the most direct meaning was Li Huaqing's dissatisfaction with Li Tianlan. Holding the meeting here not only put great pressure on Li Tianlan and the giant group, but also showed his attitude to other groups. Li Tianlan was expressionless and didn't say anything from beginning to end. The Qin family specially arranged a relatively quiet room in the backyard for Qin Fangqing. The room was not very big, so it seemed extremely crowded after the high-level people walked in. There were still a lot of people present today. Not only the 9 counselors, but also the 3 deputy prime ministers of the cabinet, 2 national advisors, Speaker of Yuzhou by Zhanfang, 4 deputy ministers of the military headquarters, by Qing Zhao, the deputy secretary general, and the counselors of the Ministry of Personnel, the Ministry of Personnel, the Coalition Ministry, and other departments were all present. Li Huaqing sat in the main seat and silently looked at everyone present. Li Tianlan sat opposite Li Huaqing with a blank face. He didn't say a word and his mind was wandering. I just met the Prime Minister yesterday. Li Huaqing was silent for about 5 minutes before he slowly said, "We talked until late. Last night, he was still discussing the development of Zhongzhou State with me. Who could have thought that today?" There was an extremely sincere regret and sigh in his tone. No one knew what he really thought. Guo Wenyan took out a cigarette and lit it. He said slowly, "We've been communicating a lot recently. The Prime Minister has been under a lot of pressure recently and often suffers from insomnia. His headache is an old problem and he's talked to the doctor about it, but the doctor didn't have a good solution. He just prescribed some painkillers and told him to rest well." Guo Wenyan laughed at himself and said, "Pay attention to rest. As far as I know, the Prime Minister's work and rest have been extremely chaotic in recent years, and a lot of things have happened recently. How can he have any rest?" There was silence. The Prime Minister has always been very concerned about the affairs of the cabinet. The Prime Minister's vision has always been very long-term. He pays attention to the future of the cabinet. At the same time, he often reflects on the past of the cabinet, combines the past with the present, summarizes the experience, and explores the future road. A few days ago, the Prime Minister mentioned to me that the future of the cabinet still needs new ideas, a new atmosphere, and 100 schools of thought contend. Many years ago, we vigorously supported agriculture, and later, we vigorously supported industry. These correct measures have established our position in the world today. In recent years, our eyes have been locked on finance and energy. For other fields, there has been a certain neglect, so we have also missed some opportunities. So the Prime Minister feels that after the election, we should promote some talents from various aspects and enrich the breadth of thinking of the cabinet. He said that no field of the country should be abandoned. A cabinet member suddenly said in a calm and unhurried tone. Li Tianlan raised his eyelids and glanced at him, but still did not speak. The speaker was He Jingnen, a cabinet member who had been very low-key in recent years. The so-called cabinet member was theoretically at the same level as the deputy prime minister, but in fact, he had great influence but did not compete for the position of deputy prime minister. Strong people had real power in their hands, and they also had their own fields. But most of the time, they cooperated with the work of the cabinet. In other words, they cooperated with the work of the real master of the cabinet. A few years ago, He Jingnan had been in a state of semi-retirement. After this election, he was bound to retire. No one thought that in this matter, he would rush out after Guo Wenyan to be the vanguard. He Jingnan felt Li Tianlan's gaze and nodded to him, smiling politely and respectfully. He was the backbone of the Prince Group, but he could not be regarded as one of the core members. However, Qin Fangqing died suddenly. In today's Yuzhou, he was already a relatively important figure that Guo Wenyan could pull out, and Guo Wenyan also gave him an offer that he could not refuse. Originally, He Jingnan did not intend to express his position in this matter. The fields he was in charge of overlapped with Wu Jingmin's in many places. In other words, he worked with Wu Jingmin in the cabinet. After Wu Jingmin entered the cabinet, he quickly straightened out the relationship. After experiencing the means of this old fox who had carried the flag for the Li family for more than 20 years, He Jingnan chose to give in. Although he was still in office, he did not have much time to show up in the cabinet. In theory, the situation and rise and fall of the major groups in Zhongzhou state had little to do with him. But his son was now in a critical period. His son was now the mayor of East Mountain Province's Kojima City. Kojima was a vice-governor level city, but the mayor of Kojima was a vice-governor level city. Although it couldn't be said to be low in status, it wasn't too high either. Guo Wenyan almost hit his soft spot as soon as he opened his mouth. If this operation was successful, after the election, his son would be transferred to the capital city of Tianfu Province to serve as a member of the council and the speaker of the capital city. In this position, if everything went well, it was very likely that he would become the governor of Tianfu Province in a single step after 5 years. That was the real core member of the Prince Group. At his age, his son had little chance to become a director, and the Prince Group did not have such resources. But starting from the position of the governor of Tianfu Province, as long as he was not too unlucky, his son could basically reach his current height. Whether he became a member of parliament or a member of the cabinet, he could ensure the continued glory of the family. Therefore, He Jingnan did not hesitate. He just thought for a few seconds and then promised Guo Wenyan that he would fight for him at the meeting. What he said through Chen Fengqing's mouth was very implicit, but everyone was very clear about what he meant. Promote talents from various aspects and perspectives. This sentence was the key of the key. The so-called various aspects and perspectives could be understood as focusing on officials with different talents. But there was no shortage of such different types of officials in the major groups. Even the weakest North group had a lot of them. So this sentence was equivalent to saying that the cabinet after the election was a piece of cake placed in front of the major groups, and everyone had a chance to share a piece. In other words, the next cabinet would no longer be a group with a relative advantage. Instead, every group could make their own voices heard in different positions. This had an absolute conflict of fundamental interests with the future planning of the new group. Wu Jingmin became the second minister. Bai Qingqian became the deputy minister. The goal of the new group was clear and clear. It put its 2 leaders in the cabinet, and even sacrificed a lot of possible local interests for this. The first step of the rise of the new group was to win the right to speak in the cabinet. Now, He Jingnan wanted to let the cabinet compete. All the people of the group entered the cabinet, which also meant that the position of the new group in the cabinet would be greatly reduced, and its right to speak would also be greatly weakened. The strategy of the new group would completely fail. At that time, even if Wu Jingmin and Bai Qingqian were pushed up, the new group would only get a small number of positions and a few provinces, and its foundation would become unstable. It was hard to say what the future of such a new group would be, but at least it would be difficult to start. The cabinet's competition was the first step of the Prince Group's plan. In this plan, because there were too many voices from all sides, the authority of the second minister would be weakened to a certain extent, and the main authority would be concentrated on the prime minister. Many contradictions and conflicts needed to be mediated by the prime minister who controlled the cabinet, which further accelerated the speed at which the new prime minister accumulated prestige in the cabinet. The second step of the plan was taken over by the academics. They tried their best to push Hua Jingyang to the position of prime minister, put pressure on the new group, and curb his speed of development. The academics would fully support the first step of the Prince Group's plan. The Prince Group would fully support the second step of the academics' plan. The tacit understanding could be said to be flawless. In order to win more support, the prospect of the cabinet's competition was explained in advance, which was to rope in other groups. The cabinet was the core of the country. Each department under the cabinet meant great power, especially the departments of finance, development, security, commerce, agriculture, and industry. Not to mention the position of minister, even the deputy, or even the head of some important departments and bureaus would be fought over. When these positions were held in the hands of the major groups, they would also become some stable promotion ladder, and they were the kind with great value. Such positions, no matter how many there were, no one would complain. Since He Jingnan had said this on behalf of the Prince Group, it was equivalent to a promise from the Prince Group and the academics. Such a promise couldn't be stingy. After all, the major groups had their own dealings, and it wasn't a one-time deal. If their reputation was ruined this time, even if it was beneficial in the short term, it wouldn't be worth it in the long term. Therefore, in order to get the leadership of the cabinet, the Prince Group and the academics really planned to divide a considerable part of the cabinet's power. While roping in other groups, they suppressed the new group's plan to conquer the cabinet. It could be said to be killing two birds with one stone. Personally, I think the Prime Minister's words make sense. He Jingnan looked at Li Tianlan and immediately shifted his gaze. He wasn't too afraid of Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan did bring a lot of pressure to people, but no matter how arrogant Li Tianlan was, he wouldn't go so far as to kill his entire family just because of a few words. Everyone present knew this very well. Therefore, he continued to speak, expressing his attitude. It's simply a penetrating insight. I also hope to see a cabinet with diverse thinking. The death of the Prime Minister is a huge loss to Xianxia State, but we should unswervingly follow his path. Time will prove that he and we are both right. That is to say, I'm wrong? Li Tianlan suddenly asked. His eyes fell on He Jingnan, his eyes bright and unblinking. In fact, no one mentioned anything about him, but Li Tianlan just took it personally. No one thought he was stupid. He just sat there quietly, but as he spoke, everyone could clearly feel a kind of incomparably cold and stiff pressure. He Jingnan moved his mouth and was about to speak. Li Tianlan suddenly said, "Have you really seen the Prime Minister recently?" He Jingnan was dumbfounded. Everyone's eyes shifted to him. At this juncture, He Jingnan could not take half a step back no matter what. He braced himself and nodded, saying naturally, Of course. I don't believe it." Li Tianlan said lightly, "I don't believe the Prime Minister would say this to a dispensable cabinet member like you. It's not essential." This was an understatement, but in He Jingnan's ears, it had the effect of killing people. He Jingnan's face suddenly turned red. But before he could explode in anger, Li Tianlan had already continued, "I will send someone to investigate this matter. Your specific whereabouts these days will soon be investigated. Here, today, you can say whatever you want, even in the name of the Prime Minister. But today, everyone is sitting here. If you haven't seen the Prime Minister, it is tantamount to deceiving the entire Xianxia State. At that time, even if Xianxia State does not touch you, I will make you pay the price." He Jingnan's body stiffened. His snow-white beard trembled and his face was a little pale. "Your Majesty is really domineering," Hua Zhenyang suddenly said with sarcasm. Li Tianlan glanced at him. Whether it was He Jingnan or the Prince Group, they were important, but they weren't absolutely important. Everyone knew that whether the new group could conquer the cabinet or not had a direct and absolute relationship with whether Hua Zhenyang could become the new Prime Minister. He was the biggest obstacle on the way to the rise of the new group. I don't want to be deceived, especially in the name of a dead man. Everyone is very clear about the Prime Minister's character. He distinguishes between merits and demerits. No one will deny what he has done. Such a person should be respected enough. But if someone uses his death to seek benefits for themselves, then where does the Prime Minister stand? Where does the cabinet stand? I will investigate it clearly and make some people pay the price. I do this to be responsible for Xianxia State." Li Tianlan's voice was cold and tough. The conversation seemed to be at an impasse. Li Huaqing silently watched the other people in the room without batting an eyelid. Hua Zhenyang's eyebrows twitched slightly. He wanted to say something, but he held back. Li Tianlan's words were equivalent to the most naked threat. He was not only threatening He Jingnan. It was also Hua Zhenyang. He Jingnan spoke in the name of Chen Fangqing. Li Tianlan used Xianxia State to fight back. Be responsible for Xianxia State. Li Tianlan was already qualified to say this. No one present, including Li Huaqing, dared to say to Li Tianlan that Xianxia State did not need his responsibility. No one dared to say it, and no one could bear such a responsibility. So this extremely tough threat meant that Li Tianlan had forced the academics to the brink of falling out with him. Falling out completely? This was definitely not what Li Huaqing wanted to see. In the silence, Li Tianlan slowly tapped on the table in front of him. His fingers jumped rhythmically on the table, and the other hand supported his face. He tilted his body and looked at He Jing'an. Now, I will give you another chance. Tell me, have you seen the Prime Minister recently? He Jing'an's body trembled obviously. He wanted to speak, but he lost all his courage for a moment. Li Huaqing frowned and suddenly said, "Okay, we can discuss this matter later. Let's go back to Hidden Dragon Sea and hold a formal meeting." He paused and said calmly, "Huayang, you stay and see if there is anything else the Qin family needs." The Prime Minister left suddenly. You have to temporarily take charge of the work of the cabinet so that he can leave at ease. Temporarily arrest him? Was this temporarily really temporary, or? Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows and showed a sneer. Li Huaqing, did you want to set the tone directly? Ji Wenjiang and Wan Qingyun also raised their heads at the same time, looked at each other, and wanted to speak. But Li Tianlan had already beaten them to it. I'm different. He didn't finish his words either. It was because at the instant he spoke, cries of grief suddenly sounded from within the Qin clan. Wails of despair and misery filled the air. Such a sound was very common in the news of Chen Fangqing's death. However, the voice that had suddenly appeared seemed to have been magnified thousands of times in an instant. Li Tianlan was stunned. The next moment, the door of the temporary meeting room was suddenly pushed open. Li Huaqing's secretary, Ma Si, rushed in a panic. Behind Ma Si, the secretary of Hua Ziyang and Wu Jingmin also rushed in. President, everyone. Ma Si's breathing was a little short, and his face was extremely ugly. When he spoke, he subconsciously looked at Li Tianlan, with a touch of fear in his eyes, avoiding eye contact. Li Tianlan's heart sank for no reason. Ma Si's voice was like an icy wind, blowing quickly through the meeting room and into everyone's heart. Just 2 minutes ago, in the ambulance. Ma Si said in a dry voice, Governor Qianxia passed away, the cause of death, cerebral hemorrhage. There was a dead silence. Li Tianlan's body stiffened in place. His face became completely livid. Chapter 1086. The crowd hurried, and the huge mansion of the Qin family was completely shrouded in a desperate and tragic atmosphere. The male relatives of the Qin family could barely support their bodies to receive the guests, but the women had completely lost their souls. There was no more sorrow, no more crying. Everyone sat in the morning hall in a daze, like puppets placed in the morning hall. A brand new morning hall belonging to Qianxia was quickly set up. The number of people who came to the Qin family increased in less than 2 hours after Qianxia's death. The news of the death of the father and son of the Qin family spread from the temporary conference room. The resolution had been formed, the documents were sent to various places, and the major media software pushed the news at the same time. At this time, almost all of Zhongzhou state had known that the Prime Minister and Qianxia died on the same day. Li Tianlan was still the biggest suspect. Chen Fangqing's death shocked people and Li Tianlan's madness. But Qianxia's death made almost everyone angry. It was too much. Everyone felt the same way. Li Tianlan was challenging the most basic bottom line that the whole Zhongzhou state had formed for hundreds of years. Killing the Prime Minister, killing the governor, if he could get through this safely, who would he not dare to kill in the future? Status was meaningless, position was meaningless, power was meaningless, and everyone in the whole Zhongzhou state would be shrouded in the shadow of Emperor Dong's palace. Would such a Zhongzhou state still be Zhongzhou state? Not anymore. The answer was yes. Not anymore. Such a Zhongzhou state was a cage. Perhaps no one would sympathize with Chen Fangqing and Qianxia, but when they got the news, countless people started to unite and began to resist Li Tianlan. Power and the privileged class were unpopular in the eyes of most people, but they must exist. This was the most stable part of the order. Such stability was magnified to some extent, and became one of the sources of social stability. When the so-called privilege and power were killed by people who ignored the rules, regardless of the impact, Such people became lunatics in the eyes of everyone. A lunatic who must die. The news of the death of the father and son of the Chen family was like a thunder, arousing endless killing intent and hostility. The most obvious and the first thing to show was the number of people who came to the Chen family to offer their condolences. The deputy speaker of Yuzhou province arrived first. Nobody thought too much about the deputy speaker who had the background of Special Warfare Group. Closely after that, the deputy mayor of Yuzhou province, the director of the development committee and the deputy minister of the Ministry of Personnel arrived. Everybody sensed something unusual. The patriarchs of the rich and powerful families brought their core members to pay a visit. Some of these patriarchs were close to the Prince group, some to the North group, and some to the Giant group. But all of them came. They remained silent, expressing their support for the Chen family in silence. The meeting in the temporary conference room continued. Li Huaqing, who had originally planned to move the venue, once again chose to continue the meeting after hearing the news of Qin Shi's death. Li Tianlan did not come out again. But everyone could imagine how fiercely Li Tianlan, even Dongqing Wudi, Wu Jingmin, and the others were suffering now. The meeting had been going on for nearly 5 hours. The sky had already darkened and night had fallen. The mansion of the Qin family was bustling. A large number of officials gathered here. After coming here, except for those who had urgent matters, they were not in a hurry to leave. Even if a few left, they left their secretaries here. More and more people came to the Qin family. After dinner, these people still gathered in 2s and 3s, occasionally glancing at a certain corner. In that corner, the chubby Xianyuan Wushang, who did not look aggressive at all, was sitting there silently, with a cup of cold tea in front of him. Xianyuan Wushang's expression was even gloomier than Li Tianlan's. Every few seconds, the gazes from every corner would sweep past him, intentionally or unintentionally, with disgust that they wanted to hide but couldn't. Xianyuan Wushang knew very well that this disgust was because he came with Li Tianlan, and people all knew that he was Li Tianlan's driver. If they treated him like this, how much would they feel about Li Tianlan now? These people discussed Li Tianlan. As time passed, almost the entire Zhongzhou state hated Emperor Dong's palace. It was said that several counselors from other places had now arrived in Yuzhou and were on their way to the Chen family. Obviously, the meeting that had lasted for several hours was no longer an impromptu meeting. Chen Fangqing and even all the high-level members of the council were really angry, and they planned to discuss a clear result today. Xianyuan Wushang did not want to think about what such a result would be, but he was very clear about it. He knew that this time he was in big trouble. If Chen Fangqing's death was a huge trouble for Li Tianlan, then with Qin Shi's death on the same day, this trouble had now evolved into a near-fatal crisis in just a few hours. To Li Tianlan, Emperor Dong's palace, and the Giant group. If this matter was confirmed, then it was no longer a question of how the strength of the new group would shrink. It was no exaggeration to say that this was a question of whether Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace could continue to exist. No, this was no longer a question, because Zhongzhou state could not allow such a thing to exist. And such a thing did not even need to be confirmed. The current situation was that everyone was suspecting Li Tianlan. When everyone thought it was Li Tianlan who did it, then it didn't matter who the real culprit was. Zhongzhou state's patience had obviously reached its limit. Xianyuan Wushang didn't know how much time he had left. Maybe 1 day, maybe 3 days, maybe a week, but no more than half a month. During this period, if Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace could not come up with enough evidence to prove their innocence, then the entire Emperor Dong's palace would be completely destroyed, and Zhongzhou state would do everything to kill Li Tianlan. Without any hesitation, without any apprehension, at all costs. As long as Zhongzhou state made up its mind, Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace must die. This was a fact that did not need to be stated. It was very simple. If Li Tianlan was alive, then every high-level official in Zhongzhou state would face the irresistible threat of death. Therefore, the capital of a nation Yuandu would be fully used to kill Li Tianlan and erase everything related to him. Poison gas, bombing, surprise attack, assassination, seduction, even war, even nuclear war. Emperor Dong's palace did not have nuclear weapons, and their biggest deterrent was Li Tianlan himself. When Zhongzhou state made up its mind to eradicate Li Tianlan, they would not hesitate to take out all their trump cards. Li Tianlan was very destructive. Then they would surround him with a crowd. 100,000, 200,000, 500,000, 1 million, 2 million. The army was endless, and all kinds of high-tech weapons emerged one after another. This was not an exaggeration. If Li Tianlan could not prove his innocence, Zhongzhou state would inevitably do so. As long as there were people alive in Zhongzhou state, they would do so. At that time, the so-called new group would become a joke, Emperor Dong's palace would become ruins, and Li Tianlan would inevitably die. This was something that needed no doubt. And with Li Tianlan's death, the entire giant group would also embark on the old road that once happened in another miracle city. Dongqing Wudi by Qin Qian, Zhou Yuanshan, Dongqing Qiuqi, by Zhanfang by Qin Zhao, everyone would be liquidated. Xianyuan Wushang took a deep breath. Compared with the urgency of the situation, he felt more humiliated. He could feel that something was wrong with Chen Fangqing's inexplicable death. But after thinking about it for an afternoon, he had no idea what was wrong or how to prove it. As for Qin, he once wanted to get close to Qin Shi's body, but he was stopped by all the Qin family members with red eyes. The situation was already very dangerous. In this situation, if Zhongzhou state attacked Li Tianlan fiercely enough, maybe by tomorrow, Wu Jingmin or Dongqing Wudi would take the blame and resign. And this was just the prelude to the decline of the giant group and Emperor Dong's palace. Xianyuan Wushang suddenly stood up. He walked to a corner, took out his mobile phone, and dialed a number. The phone rang twice and was quickly connected. Xing Tian's steady and heavy voice sounded on the other end of the phone. "Your Highness, how did Qin Shi die?" Xianyuan Wushang asked. There was a silence on the other end of the phone. 2 seconds later, Xing Tian's heavy voice sounded, "I don't know." Then changed from not knowing to knowing. "I want the information of the mastermind, even a clue." Xianyuan Wushang's voice was extremely cold and ruthless. "If necessary, you can die." "Okay." Xing Tian's voice was simple and honest, without any hesitation. Xianyuan Wushang paused and continued, "And don't investigate the cause of Qin Fangqing's death." Xing Tian was a little confused. "Chen Fangqing's death makes me feel very uneasy. I don't know why, but when I look at his body, I feel fear. I can't see Qin Shi's body now. I just looked at it from a distance. That feeling doesn't make me feel uneasy, but it makes me very annoyed, very annoyed." Xing Tian was silent for a while and said softly, "I'll start investigating now." Xianyuan Wushang said that he could die if necessary, but from his words, Xing Tian clearly sensed something different. Because Xianyuan Wushang felt different. This feeling was worth relying on. The different feeling meant that the people who killed Qin Shi and Qin Fangqing might not be the same group of people. If he investigated the cause of Qin Fangqing's death, he might die instantly. But investigating Qin Shi might not be the case. Xing Tian silently hung up the phone. The wind and snow were still blowing outside the window of Yuzhou. It had been snowing for a day, and the whole of Yuzhou was covered in a cold, silvery white. Xing Tian stood in front of the window for a while, then slowly turned around and sat on the sofa. His huge body seemed to have become absolutely quiet the moment he sat down. Breathing, heartbeat, everything became inaudible. Xing Tian reached out and grabbed something in the air. The air twisted in his hand and finally turned into an incorporeal brush in his palm. He grabbed again with his other hand. The air seemed to have been pulled down by him, making a crisp sound. It sounded like he was tearing off a piece of paper with a slight force. The air with some irregular edges was casually placed on the table. Xing Tian held the incorporeal brush and stared at the incorporeal paper on the table. He was a calligrapher. In this field, he had the ability to see some things clearly. For example, the cause of Qin Shi's death. Xing Tian slowly put the brush down and slowly drew a line on the incorporeal paper. The incorporeal tip of the brush swept across the incorporeal paper, leaving a light red line. Xing Tian thought for a while and wrote 2 words on the paper. 6 years. Before he finished writing the 2 words, the incorporeal red line disappeared. Xianxia was stunned. He knew that the starting point he was looking for was Li Tianlan, but Li Tianlan couldn't be the starting point. He drew another line and wrote down 2.5 years. The light red line appeared steadily on the paper. The tip of the brush began to tremble. Xianxia wrote a line. Qi Mulin died. In the blink of an eye, countless densely packed words suddenly covered the empty piece of paper. Before Xianxia had time to take a look, the handwriting disappeared completely. Xianxia was a little depressed, but he had to try another way. He took the brush and didn't plan the time. Instead, he randomly found a starting point and wrote, "I ate 5 caddies of rice last night." Countless versions of himself began to emerge. It was like countless options, neatly arranged. The rice came from Thailand. The rice came from Zhongzhou State. The rice came from... Countless places appeared in front of Xianxia. The option of the rice came from Zhongzhou State glowed red. Xianxia clicked on the option that glowed red and wrote another sentence. It tastes good. The dense handwriting seemed to be Xianxia's thoughts that had been imprinted. Xianxia's whole person became completely quiet. When everything went smoothly, under his control, the brush in his hand quickly continued to write. At this moment, his huge body began to fade slowly. The light in the room dimmed. His figure became fainter and fainter, and finally became a shadow. The shadow was still constantly thinning, and finally became a shadow without a head. And the shadow without a head kept writing something on the paper. His writing speed was even more exaggerated than a computer-generated file. In the blink of an eye, dense handwriting had appeared in front of him. Xianxia entered the real state of unconsciousness. On the incorporeal paper, the content appeared chaotically and clearly. "I ate 5 caddies of rice last night, and it tasted good. His Majesty attached great importance to us, so he informed the kitchen to buy more of this kind of rice. The origin of the rice came from Longjiang, Zhongzhou State, and the kitchen stock was running out. The kitchen supervisor went to the supermarket in Xianyuan City to buy and encountered a small car accident on the way. His Majesty took us to Yuzhou. The Ritz-Carlton Hotel was very luxurious. The front desk lady did not look very good. His Majesty and His Highness entered the hidden Dragon Sea. Chen Fangqing's spirit was in an extremely unstable state. Xianxia was still writing, but the content had become a wavy line. Xianxia himself did not notice the scene. The content of the handwriting continued. Chen Fangqing saw Wu Jingmin. His consciousness was chaotic, and his spirit was in a relaxed state. The 2 majesties arrived at the hotel smoothly and received the room card from the front desk lady on duty. The front desk lady was in a very bad mood. Her father was a truck driver who worked in Nanyun all year round, responsible for transporting supplies from Nanyun to Ningbian and Xianyuan City. But her father had a car accident in Xianyuan City today. She had a deep hostility to the 2 majesties from Tianan. A young man came to the Ritz-Carlton Hotel and saw the front desk lady on duty. Xianxia's handwriting suddenly paused. Bang! In the slight sound, the brush in his hand and the paper in the void instantly exploded. Xianxia, who had become a phantom, instantly turned into a huge corpse. A mouthful of blood sprayed directly from his mouth. He opened his eyes. His eyes flickered with a touch of shock. He was originally calculating the cause of Qin Shi's death, but after entering the real state, he was cleverly misled. The direction of his investigations seemed to point to Qin Fangqing. There was a touch of shock in Xianxia's eyes. The blown-up paper was pieced together in front of him. He looked at the words that had been written and frowned. It was not because there were too many words on it, but because there were too few words. There was a very interesting saying in the Miracle City that a butterfly in the tropical rainforest of the Amazon River in South America could cause a tornado in Texas 2 weeks later with an occasional flap of its wings. This was the very famous butterfly effect. This was a strange chaotic phenomenon, but it was limited to one system. Xianxia was a calligrapher, and his ability was more comprehensive. He could cross multiple systems in all directions. Starting from a small thing, it formed a huge chain reaction. There were countless explanations to explain the cause of Qin Fangqing's death from this aspect. Now there were billions of people on the earth, so there might be billions of explanations for Qin Fangqing's death. These explanations were correct to a certain extent, but not completely correct. From the perspective of the butterfly effect, Qin Fangqing's death might be because a beggar in Zhongzhou State sneezed, or it might be because a group of Star State high school students made a beautiful three-point shot. These reasons were real and objective. They were right and wrong. Xing Tian looked at the paper silently. What would happen if he continued to write on this paper? He started with the dinner he cooked as a starting point, and then found lines that could be constantly developed and changed. For example, the kitchen supervisor had a small car accident. For example, Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai arrived in Yuzhou and returned to the hotel. For example, Qin Fangqing met Wu Jingmin. For example, the receptionist of the hotel was the daughter of a truck driver. These were 4 things, but if he continued, each of them had infinite development possibilities. The receptionist might have a relative who was an official, and he wanted to help the receptionist solve the problem. Maybe her boyfriend was a rich young master, and he planned to use his power. Involvement. Xing Tian now had 4 lines in his hands. And these 4 lines would be involved in any direction, and it would be more and more people would be involved. Each line had tens of thousands of different twists and turns. When more and more people were involved, these 4 lines would eventually merge in one direction and become a line. All the people involved would become branches, and then develop again. Eventually, it would definitely touch Xianxia, and then touch the behind-the-scenes manipulator who killed Xianxia. This could be said to be the butterfly effect. But more accurately, it was cause and effect. There was cause and effect. This was the power of cause and effect, and also the ability of calligraphers. However, the direction of Xing Tian's investigation was obviously disturbed. Before his 4 lines formed an absolute connection, a young man suddenly appeared in the story. The brush and paper in his hands all exploded because of the appearance of the young man. Xing Tian didn't know who he was, but he was sure that the young man had an absolute relationship with Qin Fangqing's death. And this was something he couldn't write, even if he died. Xing Tian sat on the sofa, silently thinking about a way to get around this interference. He changed the pen and paper again. Just at the moment when the tip of the pen was about to touch the paper, an earth-shattering sound suddenly rang in his ears. The sound was so loud that it almost completely shattered his whole consciousness in an instant. Xing Tian's brain was instantly in chaos. He turned his head in disbelief and looked at the door. Opposite the door was Li Tianlan and Qin Weibai's bedroom. That was the origin of the loud noise. And Qin Weibai was still in the bedroom. Chapter 1087. It was quiet in the luxury suite of the hotel. But Qin Weibai's mood was always up and down. All kinds of emotions were brewing in her heart, making her feel complicated. She was a little worried but not like it. She was happy but not like it. She was anxious but not like it. She was looking forward to it but not like it. Her body was still soft after being tossed and turned all night. That kind of extreme joy and satisfaction slowly dissipated, replaced by obvious sleepiness. All kinds of emotions kept emerging, seeming right but not right, making Qin Weibai feel a little confused. She felt as if something was going to happen, but she didn't know what it was. During this period, she seemed to think of something. She put on her clothes and went downstairs with a blush on her face. She bought something from a nearby pharmacy and came back to try it, confirming that she was not pregnant. That was to say, her current mood had little to do with Li Tianlan's love for her day and night in the past month or so. But this kind of uneasy mood had a lot to do with Li Tianlan. Qin Weibai didn't tell anyone. She had never dreamed of Li Tianlan in her dreams since she was a child. This statement was not very exact, but it could be said to be accurate. In the trance, she had dreamed of many scenes related to Li Tianlan, but that feeling made Qin Weibai feel like she was watching a movie about the past. In those dreams, there was Li Tianlan. But it was not Li Tianlan in reality. Li Tianlan's figure in the dream had always been vague. Even if he appeared beside her in the dream, Li Tianlan was just a shadow, an erratic shadow. In Qin Weibai's dream, Li Tianlan's clothes, face, and temperament changed thousands of times every second. The changes were so drastic that in Qin Weibai's consciousness, Li Tianlan in the dream had no facial features, and he was even a shadow without a body. But every time she saw that shadow, Qin Weibai's consciousness in the dream would tell her that it was Li Tianlan. She in the dream also believed it. She and the master of Samsara Palace, who was in Warefree Heights now, were really the same person. They had the same consciousness, the same habits, and the same thoughts. At a short distance, the two of them could share the hurt with each other or bear it alone. At a distance, their thoughts were completely synchronized. Both of them knew what the other was thinking all the time because it was their own thoughts. At a further distance, their dreams were completely synchronized. To be exact, when the master of Samsara Palace was in the southern hemisphere and Qin Weibai was in the northern hemisphere, when they were resting at the same time, their dreams were completely identical. Therefore, for the current Qin Weibai, Li Tianlan was a ghost that had been lingering in her consciousness since she was a child. She kept synchronizing with the master of Samsara Palace and eventually became the same person. They had the same thoughts, so naturally, they had the same feelings. Therefore, there was no obstacle for her to accept Li Tianlan. But she had always been confused. She loved him so much and was willing to give everything for him. But why was Li Tianlan just a shadow in her dream? More than 2 years ago, after the Eternal Sword of Mormons, the shadow that belonged to Li Tianlan, which was constantly changing every moment, began to appear more and more in Qin Weibai's dreams. Qin Weibai knew what was going on. This was the master of Samsara Palace's entrustment. In the past, Qin Weibai would also dream, but the source of Li Tianlan in her dreams was the master of Samsara Palace. Now the illusory shadow representing Li Tianlan frequently appeared in her dreams because, in a sense, the other Li Tianlan was already dead. She might not be completely dead, but she was definitely not alive in her current state. So Li Tianlan began to appear suddenly in her dreams. He appeared more and more often, but the shadow became more and more blurred. The master of Samsara Palace broke through the transcendent realm in the spiritual field in the Eternal Sword. Now, Qin Weibai was improving every moment. There was no obstacle for her to enter the so-called transcendent realm. Before she went to the desert prison, she had been close to the so-called extreme realm in the spiritual field. Therefore, she consciously built a garden in her dream. A garden where sunlight and flying snow danced together. That was her most hidden territory and the starting point of all her dreams. Qin Weibai's only regret was that there was no Li Tianlan in that garden. She even thought more than once that if she could completely connect her consciousness with Li Tianlan's and form a certain degree of thinking synchronization, then in her dreams, could she also bring Li Tianlan into that garden and let their dreams be completely connected? In this way, even if she was not by his side in the future, she could see him in her dreams. It was not him in her imagination, but the real consciousness of Li Tianlan in her dreams. If she let him bully her in her dreams, she would not let him be so gluttonous and unrestrained as he was now. She really thought about this problem seriously. Then she saw Li Tianlan in her dreams. Li Tianlan in his youth. The ancient tree, the wind and snow, the dense sword marks, the boy, and the wooden sword were not things in Qin Weibai's dreams. There was only the garden in her dream, which was the source of the dream. In the source, if Qin Weibai didn't want her dream to expand freely, she could make herself stay in the garden and see nothing out of the control of her spirit. But in such a state she actually saw Li Tianlan. This was obviously an unusual scene. But why would such a situation occur? The teenager Li Tianlan in the dream was extremely clear and real, just like the child who really lived in Qin Weibai's dream. Qin Weibai woke up at that moment. But when she woke up, she still felt that the child was still living in the snow beside the garden. The ancient tree had collapsed, but he seemed to know nothing and still sat there quietly. That feeling was unparalleled. Qin Weibai could be sure that it was not Li Tianlan constructed by her consciousness. The Li Tianlan she constructed with her consciousness was just a faint shadow. He was not a teenager, and even his figure was extremely vague. And not to mention that she had not reached the transcendent realm. Even if she had really entered the transcendent realm, she could not merge her consciousness with Li Tianlan's to form synchronization in the dream. This kind of thing, according to Qin Weibai's understanding, could only exist in fantasy, and it was just fantasy. So who was the teenager in her dream? Qin Weibai was a little uneasy. She carefully recalled the garden in the dream. The flowers were bright, the sun was bright, and the snow was cold. The teenager outside the garden was quiet and plain. It was a very beautiful picture, but it was so beautiful that it was not lively at all. Qin Weibai suddenly felt an indescribable sense of strangeness and horror. It was normal for her to recall every scene in the dream. But the more she thought about it, the weirder she felt. That kind of deeply hidden weirdness was originally completely hidden, but with the appearance of the young Li Tianlan, all the abnormalities were revealed little by little. Qin Weibai sat on the bed and wrapped herself in the quilt. The flying snow crossed the sky through the opened curtains. Without Li Tianlan, the bedroom suddenly became very cold. She sat quietly like this. She didn't eat at noon. As time went by, she became more and more sleepy and began to struggle with her eyelids, but she always forced herself to hold on. At the thought of the teenager Li Tianlan in the dream, she felt a little scared and even dared not sleep. However, the extreme mental fatigue caused her consciousness to become deeper and deeper, deeper and deeper. Qin Weibai's body slid from the sitting position little by little. She lay down again and fell asleep again in a daze. It was still the bright and colorful garden. But the sunshine in the sky disappeared. The snowflakes were scattered and dancing. Qin Weibai stood where she was, feeling the gloomy sky in the dream, and understood that it was because she was too tired now. The flowers in the garden swayed slightly in the wind and snow. Qin Weibai stood stiffly in the garden in the dream, looking straight ahead. She even dared not turn her head. From her position, as long as she turned right, she could see the gate of the garden. If the teenager was still there, she might see the teenager Li Tianlan first. Qin Weibai on the bed breathed unsteadily and frowned. In the dream, she was already extremely nervous. The wind and snow in the air seemed to be much fiercer. In the dream, Qin Weibai clearly felt the cold. She kept taking deep breaths several times before she controlled herself to slowly turn her head. The first thing that came into her sight was not the gate of the garden, nor the teenager Li Tianlan outside the gate. Instead, it was a thick and old tree that blocked out the sky and the sun but was completely black. The dark giant tree stood outside the gate of the garden. In the wind and snow, the trunk, the treetop, the leaves, everything was quiet and almost dead, without the slightest tremor. Qin Weibai's body was cold, and her heart kept sinking. It seemed to be the giant tree that she had seen before that had collapsed. However, when he entered the dream for the second time, the tree had returned to its original appearance. No, it seemed that many years had passed in the dream. Not only did the tree return to its original appearance, but it had also become even stronger. The entire tree had also begun to turn dark and deathly still. There was no teenager under the tree, no wooden sword. There was emptiness. Qin Weibai breathed a sigh of relief. The moment her nervous mood relaxed, she suddenly froze again and looked carefully at the giant tree. Countless snowflakes fell under the crown of the giant tree, but the distribution of the snowflakes was somewhat different. There was a small area where the snowflakes seemed to be floating quietly. It seemed that there was something invisible there that supported the snowflakes and did not let them fall. Qin Weibai looked at it quietly. She looked for a long time before she finally confirmed that there seemed to be an illusory figure that had almost completely become nothingness there. He stayed there indifferently. If she did not look carefully, she could not find him at all. Qin Weibai breathed a sigh of relief in her heart. She knew that she dreamed of Li Tianlan again. In the case of extreme mental exhaustion, the control of the source of the garden was loosened. She dreamed of Li Tianlan at the source of the dream. The Li Tianlan in her dream was this shadow, which was changing every second and was almost transparent. After all, it was something in her consciousness. The coldness in Qin Weibai's heart slowly dissipated. She walked over briskly. In her dream, the Li Tianlan in her dream could do a lot of things. But this time, The illusory shadow that seemed like it would dissipate at any moment did nothing. He sat quietly under the tree, as if he was extremely tired and resting, but also as if he was thinking about something. His posture looked a little strange. Qin Weibai looked for a long time before she realized that the shadow's body was a little tilted. This posture seemed to be held in someone's arms. Qin Weibai looked at it carefully. It meant that there was nothing next to the illusory shadow of Li Tianlan. Beside him, there was only the dark giant tree. The dark tree was far thicker than what she saw in the garden. But as Qin Weibai walked closer, the state of the giant tree became clear in her eyes. The giant tree in front of her seemed to be torn apart as well. At this time, there were pieces of metal fragments of different colors inserted in the trunk of the giant tree. Qin Weibai couldn't recognize what kind of metal they were, but she could vaguely feel the color of the metal fragments. However, the originally colorful metal fragments were all dim at this time. Dense cracks spread on each fragment, which was shocking. The cracks spread from the roots to countless branches. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even more pieces of metal were densely packed together. The black giant tree was completely torn by the metal fragments. The giant tree was trembling slightly, and the dark and lusterless sap slowly flowed down from the trunk, like pieces of black blood. Qin Weibai's brows were tightly knitted together. The illusory shadow representing Li Tianlan was still sitting there, as if it would dissipate at any time, but it never did. Qin Weibai stopped in front of the shadow and looked at the giant tree behind him. The giant tree trembled more and more obviously, and the black blood seemed to have flowed into a small waterfall. She didn't know why, but Qin Weibai suddenly felt that the tree should be much bigger than what she had seen. The source of her dream was limited, so the tree seemed to have shrunk many times. It was a very natural feeling. She felt that if the tree really existed, it would be almost infinitely tall, and every piece of metal fragment inserted in the trunk would probably be big enough to cover the whole sky. The tree and the fragments were infinitely shrunk. Only the size of the shadow was ordinary. Black blood flowed down from the trunk, as if to completely drown the shadow. However, a powerful aura blocked all the black liquid outside. It seemed to be a sword energy. Qin Weibai was a little confused. When she walked out of the garden, the dream had already unfolded from the source. She didn't know why she had such a dream. The giant black tree was very close to her. Qin Weibai could clearly feel countless emotions from the patches of black blood. Bloody, cruel, evil, chaotic, violent, resentful. Dark and gloomy. The metal fragments inserted in the trunk reflected a faint light. The light was absolutely cold, with an absolutely complete and perfect law, forming a natural sense of repulsion. Qin Weibai really didn't dare to move for a moment. She suddenly found that whether she was close to the black giant tree or those metal fragments, she would end up horribly. She was only the safest when she was around the shadow. But the shadow itself was the most illusory. Tianlan. In the dream, Qin Weibai called softly. The shadow was silent, motionless, and didn't respond at all. This was different from her usual dreams. Qin Weibai thought about it and did what she used to do in her dreams. This was her dream. Everything in front of her was a continuation of her consciousness. She had absolute authority here. In her dream, Li Tianlan was just a shadow that was constantly changing every minute and second. Qin Weibai would try to focus her attention and her consciousness every time to make Li Tianlan become clear. Such an attempt had never succeeded. But she would keep trying until she woke up naturally. Qin Weibai gently sat next to the shadow and looked at it seriously. She began to concentrate her attention and focus her consciousness. The dream began to shake unstably. This was a sign that she was about to wake up after doing something deliberately in the dream. Qin Weibai looked at the shadow in front of her calmly. The shadow began to become clear in her constant concentration. A shallow, faint outline appeared in the almost transparent shadow. The outline began to have slight edges. A touch of color gradually appeared in her sight. It was purple. The moment the purple color appeared, it began to change into various complex colors. Qin Weibai had long been used to this change. However, This change only appeared for a few seconds today, and then it was completely fixed. The constantly changing color disappeared. A shocking black and red color appeared in front of Qin Weibai. No, it was not black and red. It was a black windbreaker. However, the windbreaker was stained with large patches of blood. The blood was almost smeared on every corner of the black windbreaker, which looked sad and tragic. The smell of blood began to appear in the dream. The black windbreaker with a corner stained with blood became completely clear and did not change. It did not change. Qin Weibai's heart began to sink like crazy, as if falling into an ice cave. Because this time, Li Tianlan's body was also fixed and did not change. More and more black windbreakers began to appear. The bloodstains spread all the way down. But what Qin Weibai saw was only a black windbreaker. In the dream, she did not see Li Tianlan's leg. It seemed to be cut by an extremely sharp weapon. One of Li Tianlan's leg had completely disappeared. The wound seemed to have happened not long ago. Hot blood was flowing from the wound, and the hem of the windbreaker was almost completely soaked in blood. The shadow became clearer and clearer. Qin Weibai saw Li Tianlan's other leg. No, it was the other half of the leg. His calf also disappeared, and so did his knee. Ghastly white bones and blood spread from his thigh. The surrounding air suddenly became hot and boiling. Li Tianlan's sleeve appeared. The empty sleeve was dancing feebly, and blood slowly dripped down from the cuff. His other hand still looked good, but the skin of that arm had turned bluish-gray. Dense metal fragments were stuck in every corner of his arm, tearing his finger joints and tearing his muscles and blood vessels. It was a bloody arm, as if someone had fired thousands of bullets directly at the arm at the same time. The heart-wrenching pain broke out from Qin Weibai's consciousness in an instant. She saw most of Li Tianlan's body. She saw his chest and abdomen. The black windbreaker on his chest and abdomen had long been broken, and dense wounds crisscrossed his chest and abdomen. The blood and white bones stimulated Qin Weibai's nerves wildly. On his chest, Li Tianlan's left and right atriums were completely empty. His two hearts had been taken out, and only blood was still flowing. Qin Weibai's body trembled violently. She had tried countless times to make the shadow that represented Li Tianlan become clear, but she never expected that the shadow would be in such a state after it became clear. It was a nightmare that she didn't want to recall in any case. She trembled and raised her head. At this moment, the shadow became completely real. She saw the shadow's head. That was Li Tianlan's head. This shadow was indeed Li Tianlan. One of Li Tianlan's eye sockets was empty and dark. The blood seemed to have completely solidified the moment the eyeball was taken out, and there was another shocking wound between his eyebrows. It seemed to be a fingerprint. It was this fingerprint that pressed between Li Tianlan's eyebrows, penetrated his brain completely in an instant, and cut off all his vitality. Qin Weibai almost suffocated. It was really Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan's corpse. No. To be precise, it should be Li Tianlan's mutilated corpse. It was not even a complete corpse. This corpse, which seemed to have just died or fallen for countless years, sat there quietly. His face was covered with blood, but with a strange calmness and exhaustion. The moment this figure appeared, the giant black tree and the endless metal fragments behind him became completely quiet. The black blood disappeared. The giant tree was no longer shaking, and the metal fragments were no longer reflecting light. All the auras also disappeared, as if all of them had become dormant and chosen to retreat. The mutilated corpse still sat quietly, not looking at Qin Weibai, just quietly looking at the distance in the dream. The world was spinning. Qin Weibai screamed out loud. Not in the dream, but in the bedroom. Her body sat up from the bed in an instant, her eyes red, her face covered with tears, and she looked miserable. Why? Her body trembled violently. Why did I have such a dream? It's not a dream. A soft and ethereal voice rang out beside Qin Weibai. It was soft and pleasant, with a sense of intimacy. Qin Weibai was quiet for a moment. She turned her head. A figure shrouded in light sat quietly on the side of the bed, looking at her silently. Qin Weibai couldn't see her face or expression, but she could only be sure that it was a woman. It seemed that her consciousness was still immersed in the dream. She was stunned for a long time, and the first question was not how the other party came in, but asked with a trembling voice, "If it's not a dream, what is it?" "That is His Majesty Li Tianlan." In the light, the woman said softly, "Whether it is the shadow you saw or the mutilated corpse, they are all—" After a pause, she said, "They are all his most real state." You're tuning in to the Wandering Hero YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.